A thin line of smoke rises from a brazier near the eastern wall of Jerusalem, and a man kneels beside it, warming hands that will not stop shaking. It is October in the year 1307, though he does not think of it that way. He thinks of it as Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday, the days having blurred together in the weeks since the soldiers came for him. He was not a famous man. He kept the horses fed and the harnesses oiled at a small commandery in the French countryside, a place most people never heard of and never will. He believed, until the morning they dragged him from his bed, that his life belonged to God and to an order of warrior monks that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. By the time the sun rose that day, he understood that belief was no longer enough to protect him. We are not actually in Jerusalem. We are in a cell in Paris, and the year is 1307, and this man is one of thousands who woke that same morning to the same knock on the door, the same torches in the dark, the same accusation that would follow the Knights Templar into legend. But to understand why this happened to him, why an order once so powerful that kings borrowed money from it could be dismantled in a single coordinated dawn raid, we have to go back nearly 200 years to a much quieter, much dustier beginning. We have to go back to 9 tired men and a stable that used to be a stable of horses, in a city that had just been conquered, in a century that did not yet know what a Templar was. Welcome. I'm glad you're here tonight. If you're new to this channel, this is The Quiet Past, and what we do is settle into history the way you might settle into a favorite armchair, slowly, without rushing, without the noise. Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through the entire life of the Knights Templar, from its improbable beginning as a handful of impoverished knights guarding pilgrim roads, through its extraordinary rise as bankers and warriors and landowners across half of Europe, all the way to its sudden, brutal end at the hands of a French king who owed it more money than he could ever hope to repay. There is no need to remember every date. There is no test at the end. Just let the story carry you, and if your eyes get heavy along the way, that's exactly what this is for. Before we go further, if you don't mind, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always like knowing that somewhere out there, someone is curled up under a blanket while history plays quietly in the background. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep making these long, slow evenings possible. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a city still smoking from conquest, and to the strange idea that a knight could also be a monk. A city still learning to be safe. Jerusalem in the year 1119 was not the city of gold that European imaginations like to picture. Only 20 years earlier, in 1099, the armies of the First Crusade had taken the city after a brutal siege, and the killing that followed left scars that lingered in memory long after the blood had been washed from the streets. By the time our story begins, Jerusalem belonged to a fragile new state called the Kingdom of Jerusalem, ruled by a Frankish king, populated by a strange mixture of European settlers, native Christians, Muslims, and Jews who had survived the conquest, and constantly threatened by the surrounding powers who had never accepted its existence. For a European pilgrim, reaching Jerusalem was the achievement of a lifetime, the kind of journey people saved for decades to make, often walking most of the way. And once the Crusader states existed, more pilgrims than ever attempted the trip, drawn by sermons and stories that promised the forgiveness of sins to anyone who touched the holy sites with their own hands. But the roads leading from the coast up into the Judean hills were not safe. Bandits, opportunistic raiders, and hostile local forces preyed on these unarmed travelers, and it was common for entire groups of pilgrims to be slaughtered within sight of the walls they were trying to reach. One especially grim account describes 300 pilgrims killed on the road to the River Jordan in a single Easter season, their bodies left for weeks because no one had the manpower to bury them safely. It was into this dangerous gap between faith and safety that a French knight named Hugues de Payens stepped, along with 8 companions, sometime around 1119. We know frustratingly little about most of these men. Their names survive in a handful of documents: Godfrey de Saint-Omer, Payen de Montdidier, Archambaud de Saint-Amand, and a few others, but their personalities, their voices, the small human details we'd love to know are lost. What we do know is their idea, and it was a genuinely strange one for its time. They proposed to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem that they form a military order, a group of knights bound by monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, whose sole purpose would be protecting pilgrims on the roads. This idea sat uneasily with existing categories of medieval life. Knights fought, monks prayed. The two vocations were understood as opposites, almost as different as fire and water, and the notion of combining them troubled a great many churchmen who felt that a man who killed, even in a righteous cause, could not simultaneously live a life of spiritual purity. It would take the support of one of the most influential religious figures in Europe to make this strange hybrid respectable, and we'll get to him shortly. But first, picture the beginning itself, because it was almost comically humble compared to what would come later. King Baldwin gave the 9 knights a headquarters on the Temple Mount, in a wing of the royal palace believed at the time to sit on the ruins of the biblical Temple of Solomon. This is where the order's name comes from, not from any temple they built, but from the one they were quartered beside, a building the Crusaders called the Templum Domini and the Templum Salomonis. Beneath this complex lay old stables, vast underground vaults originally built by Herod the Great over 1,000 years earlier, still bearing the worn grooves where ancient hitching posts had once tied up horses and carts. Archaeologists in the modern era have walked those same vaulted spaces, still visible beneath the Al-Aqsa compound, and have found stone mangers and iron rings that may well have served the Templars' own horses centuries after Herod's builders installed them. 9 men, 1 horse for close to a decade, the order remained almost invisible to history, so small and so poor that it left barely a mark in the records of the time. Membership grew slowly. If at all, some historians think the founding group of 9 may have stayed close to that number for years, which raises an obvious question. How do 9 knights meaningfully protect roads used by thousands of pilgrims a year? The honest answer is that they probably couldn't, not in any comprehensive sense. Their early function may have been more symbolic and diplomatic than practical, a visible sign that the Kingdom of Jerusalem was trying to address pilgrim safety, alongside whatever limited armed escort they could actually provide. Their poverty became legendary, quite literally worked into the order's founding symbolism. The Templars' official seal showed 2 knights mounted on a single horse, and while later writers sometimes offered more elaborate spiritual explanations for this image, tying it to the virtue of humility or the sharing of burdens between brothers, the more straightforward reading is simply that the earliest knights were too poor to each have a horse of their own. A knight without a horse was, in the military logic of the period, barely a knight at all, since mounted combat was central to how European warfare functioned. So an image of 2 men sharing 1 animal was not an abstract metaphor. It was, quite possibly, a picture of their actual situation. It's worth pausing on what daily life must have felt like for these 9 men in those early years, largely because so little of what the Templars eventually became, the fortresses, the fleets, the immense wealth, was even conceivable yet. Their days would have followed a monastic rhythm layered awkwardly on top of military duty. Hours of prayer at set intervals, simple meals eaten in near silence, vows that forbade the personal ownership of property, and long, watchful stretches on dusty roads where nothing happened for hours until, occasionally, something did. There was no grand plan yet for what this order would become. There was only the daily, unglamorous work of trying to keep a small number of vulnerable strangers alive on a road that had already claimed hundreds of lives. What changed their fortunes, and arguably changed the course of medieval European history, was a letter-writing campaign back home, and one particular churchman who decided their cause was worth championing with everything he had. The monk who made warrior monks respectable Bernard of Clairvaux was, by the late 1120s, one of the most respected and feared voices in the Latin Church, a Cistercian abbot whose opinion could make or unmake careers, whose letters were copied and circulated across Europe, and who happened to be the nephew of one of the Templars' founding knights, André de Montbard. Whether family connection played a role in his decision to champion the new order is impossible to know for certain, but champion it he did, with a theological argument that would prove enormously influential. Bernard's central claim, laid out most fully in a text usually translated as "in praise of the new knighthood," was that a knight who killed in defense of Christendom, with the correct spiritual intention, was not committing the sin of homicide but performing what he called malicide, the killing of evil itself, rather than the killing of a man. This was a genuinely radical reframing. Medieval theology had generally treated all killing, even in war, as something requiring penance, a stain on the soul even when militarily or politically necessary. Bernard's argument offered knights something they had never quite been offered before, a way to understand violence, under the right conditions, as spiritually clean rather than merely excusable. This theological cover mattered enormously for recruitment and legitimacy, and it set the stage for the Council of Troyes in January 1129, held in northeastern France, where the Templars received official church endorsement and, crucially, a formal rule to live by. Bernard himself is thought to have had a hand in drafting portions of this rule, which ran to 72 articles governing nearly every aspect of a Templar's existence: how they should dress, how often they should eat meat, how they should cut their hair, how they should behave toward women, how they should confess their sins, even how they should conduct themselves during Mass. The rule tells us things about Templar life that no other source preserves quite so intimately. Knights were to keep their hair short, but were forbidden from shaving their beards, a visual marker that distinguished them at a glance from most clean-shaven European nobility of the period, and gave them the somewhat wild, ascetic look so often associated with them in later imagination. They were to sleep in shirts and breeches, with a light always burning nearby, so that if called to arms in the night they could rise and dress instantly without fumbling in the dark. Meat was permitted 3 times a week, a moderate diet by monastic standards, and meals were to be eaten in pairs from shared dishes, again reinforcing that theme of shared poverty and mutual dependence that ran through the order's identity from the very beginning. Perhaps most tellingly, the rule reveals an order deeply anxious about the temptations that came with the presence of women. Templars were forbidden from kissing any woman, even a mother or sister, and the text explains this bluntly, that the danger of temptation from women was something greater than any other danger, and that a man who avoided the company of women altogether could serve God with a more tranquil conscience. This wasn't unusual misogyny by the standards of male monastic writing in this period. Many contemporary religious orders expressed similar anxieties, but it does tell us something about how seriously the founders took the challenge of maintaining chastity among men who had, until recently, lived as ordinary secular knights, free to marry, free to pursue the courtly romantic culture that was becoming fashionable in French noble circles at exactly this time. From 9 to thousands, Bernard's endorsement and the Church's formal recognition at Troyes transformed the Templars almost overnight from an obscure and struggling band into one of the most fashionable causes in Christian Europe. Noble families across France, England, Spain, and the Italian states began donating land, money, and sons to the order in extraordinary quantities. Some donations came from genuine religious conviction. Others came from more practical calculations. A nobleman with several sons might send one to the Templars as a way of providing for him honorably without dividing the family estate, since Templars, like other monastics, took vows of poverty that removed them from inheritance disputes entirely. The scale of this growth is worth sitting with for a moment, because it happened astonishingly fast for a medieval institution. Within about 25 years of the Council of Troyes, the Templars held property scattered from Portugal to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, from Scotland to Sicily. Wealthy patrons gave them entire villages, mills, vineyards, and farmland, often not because these patrons ever expected to see the Holy Land themselves, but because supporting the order that protected pilgrims and fought for Christendom was understood as a powerful act of piety, one that might shorten a soul's time in purgatory or simply demonstrate status and devotion to one's neighbors. This is a good moment to zoom away from theology and donation charters and think instead about who actually joined, because the popular image of the Templar as an aristocratic knight in white mantle and red cross tells only part of the story. The order was structured in tiers. At the top were the knights themselves, drawn from noble families, permitted to wear the distinctive white mantle with its red cross, a symbol added later by Pope Eugenius III to mark Templars as soldiers of the cross specifically. Below the knights were the sergeants, men of non-noble birth who nonetheless served as soldiers, craftsmen, or administrators, wearing black or brown mantles rather than white to mark the social distinction. And beyond the fighting membership entirely, the order employed and depended upon farmers, shepherds, blacksmiths, and laborers on its many estates back in Europe, most of whom never saw the Holy Land and never wielded a sword, but whose labor generated the income that funded everything else. It's easy, when picturing the Templars, to imagine only the dramatic image of mounted knights charging into battle against Saladin's forces. But for every knight fighting in the Levant, there were far more brothers back in rural France or England tending sheep, collecting rents, and managing granaries, because the order's military strength in the East depended entirely on a vast, quiet economic machine running in the background across Europe. This machine is what we'll explore next, because it's arguably the most surprising part of the entire Templar story. Surprising because it has almost nothing to do with fighting at all. The architecture of faith and stone before we follow the money. It's worth spending a few quiet minutes on how the Templars actually built, because their architectural choices tell us something about their identity that documents alone can't fully capture. Many Templar churches across Europe were built in a distinctive round or polygonal shape, a deliberate echo of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, itself built around the rotunda believed to enclose the site of Christ's tomb. The Temple Church in London, consecrated in 1185, still stands today with this round nave intact, and walking into it now, centuries later, visitors can look down at stone effigies of armored knights lying flat on their backs on the floor, hands folded in permanent prayer, their faces worn smooth by nearly 1,000 years of footsteps and candle smoke. These round churches were not the norm in medieval European ecclesiastical architecture, which overwhelmingly favored the long cruciform basilica shape inherited from Roman civic buildings. Choosing the round form was a statement, a physical reminder embedded in stone that every Templar chapel, no matter how far from the Holy Land, was spiritually tethered to Jerusalem. Imagine what it must have meant to a knight stationed in rural England or northern Spain, someone who might never make the journey east himself, to walk into his local Templar church and stand inside a shape deliberately designed to feel like a small fragment of the holiest site in Christendom had been transplanted to his own damp, gray corner of the world. Beyond the churches, Templar preceptories, the term for their local administrative houses, followed a fairly consistent pattern across the order's vast territory, typically including a chapel, dormitory, refectory for communal eating, stables, and often a fortified tower or gatehouse. These were not lavish palaces. Despite the order's growing wealth, individual Templars were still bound by vows of personal poverty, and the buildings they lived in, while often solidly and expensively constructed, tended toward functional austerity rather than decorative extravagance. The wealth of the order was collective, poured into land acquisition, military infrastructure, and eventually financial operations, rather than into personal comfort for individual brothers, at least in principle. Whether every commander lived up to that ideal in practice is one of the smaller, more human questions historians still debate, since human institutions rarely maintain perfect discipline across 2 centuries and dozens of countries. Bankers in Chainmail now, we arrive at the part of the Templar story that surprises most people the first time they hear it, because it has nothing to do with swords or sieges at all. The Templars became, in effect, one of medieval Europe's first international banking networks, and this development grew out of a genuinely practical problem faced by anyone traveling long distances in the 12th century. Carrying large amounts of coin across hundreds of miles of road was dangerous, heavy, and an open invitation to robbery. The solution the Templars offered was elegant. A pilgrim or nobleman preparing to travel to the Holy Land could deposit funds at a Templar house in, say, London or Paris, and receive in exchange a letter of credit, a coded document that could be presented at a Templar commandery in Jerusalem or Acre to withdraw an equivalent sum, minus a fee for the service. This meant a traveler could journey across the length of Christendom, carrying nothing more than a piece of parchment, rather than a fortune in gold that any bandit might relieve him of along the way. It's not an exaggeration to say this system anticipated, in a rough and early form, mechanisms that modern banking would later formalize as checks and letters of credit, centuries before anything resembling a modern bank existed. The order's financial reach grew from there into something remarkably sophisticated. Templar houses served as secure storage for the valuables of kings, nobles, and even the church itself, functioning something like a medieval safety deposit network. The Paris Temple, the order's great fortified headquarters in the French capital, became so trusted a repository that French kings themselves sometimes stored the royal treasury there, under Templar guard, rather than in their own palaces. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, one we'll return to later in this story. The very financial trust that made the Templars indispensable to the French crown is part of what would eventually make them a target, because a king who owes an institution a great deal of money has, uncomfortably, a very direct motive for wanting that institution to disappear. The Templars also extended loans, managed estates on behalf of absent noble landowners, and collected rents and agricultural income across their vast holdings, employing what amounted to a continent-spanning administrative bureaucracy of clerks, accountants, and record-keepers. Surviving Templar financial documents, where they exist, show a level of organizational sophistication that would not have been out of place in a much later era, with standardized record-keeping practices allowing the central leadership to track assets and income across an extraordinary geographic spread, from Ireland to the eastern Mediterranean. None of this happened because the founding knights ever intended to become financiers. 9 poor men sharing one horse could hardly have imagined it. It happened because a religious order dedicated to protecting pilgrims naturally ended up positioned at every point along the pilgrimage routes, holding the trust of the very people making those journeys, and trust, once established at that scale, has a way of turning into something far larger than anyone originally planned. The smell of a preceptory, let's slow down for a moment and simply be somewhere, rather than learning something. Picture a Templar preceptory in rural Yorkshire, in England, on an ordinary morning in the 1160s. The air smells of wood smoke from the kitchen fire, mixed with the damper, earthier smell of a stable close enough that the wind carries it toward the dormitory whenever the weather turns. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith is already at work, and the rhythmic ring of hammer on iron carries across the yard in a way that would have been so constant, so woven into daily life, that the brothers likely stopped consciously hearing it years ago, the way a person today stops hearing traffic outside a bedroom window. Bells structured everything. Not the great cathedral bells of a city, but smaller chapel bells marking the canonical hours, the 8 fixed points in the day set aside for prayer, running from the deep quiet of matins in the darkest part of the night through to Compline before sleep. A sergeant tending horses would have heard those bells as clearly as the knights themselves, and would have been expected, where his duties allowed, to pause and pray along with them. This rhythm, this constant, gentle interruption of physical labor by sacred obligation, is one of the hardest things for modern listeners to fully feel, because so little of contemporary life is organized around anything so regular or so unhurried. Food in these communities followed the rules' guidance, but adapted to whatever the local land produced. English preceptories drew on the wool and grain that made medieval England wealthy, some of that income flowing directly to fund operations in the Holy Land thousands of miles away. A brother might spend his entire life shearing sheep in a damp Yorkshire field, never once seeing a desert or a Muslim army, and yet understand, correctly, that his labor was part of the same great enterprise as the knights fighting at Jerusalem's gates. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it complicates the simple image of the Templar as purely a warrior. Most members of the order, across its 200-year history, likely never fought at all. The Second Crusade and a growing reputation, the Templars' first great test on the battlefield came during the Second Crusade, launched in 1147 after the fall of the Crusader county of Edessa to Muslim forces the previous year sent shockwaves through European Christendom. Bernard of Clairvaux, the same churchman who had championed the order's founding, now preached this new crusade with the same fiery persuasion, and the Templars, still a relatively young institution, found themselves called upon to prove their worth on a much larger stage than pilgrim road patrols. The campaign itself was, by most measures, a disappointment for the crusading armies, ending in a failed siege of Damascus that accomplished little beyond souring relations between the Crusader states and a city that might otherwise have remained a useful ally against other Muslim powers. But amid this broader failure, the Templars distinguished themselves in a specific and telling way. As a disciplined rearguard during the difficult overland march through Anatolia, where the crusading army, strung out along mountain roads and repeatedly ambushed by Seljuk forces, badly needed troops capable of holding formation under pressure rather than scattering in panic. This is where the Templars' unusual combination of monastic discipline and military training paid a very practical dividend. Unlike feudal knights accustomed to fighting more or less independently, seeking personal glory and individual combat, the Templars had been trained through their rule to act as a cohesive unit, obeying orders instantly and holding formation even when doing so meant absorbing punishment rather than charging forward for individual honor. Contemporary chroniclers noted this discipline approvingly, and it began to establish a reputation that would follow the order for the rest of its existence. Templars were seen, correctly or not, as the most reliable, most disciplined fighting force the Crusader states possessed. What a knight actually wore into battle, it's worth pausing on the physical reality of Templar combat, because popular imagination often pictures these knights in the pristine white mantle with its red cross, an image drawn more from ceremonial ideals than battlefield practicality. In actual combat, a Templar knight would have worn that mantle over a suit of mail armor, a garment made of thousands of interlocking iron rings, incredibly labor-intensive to produce and correspondingly expensive, weighing perhaps 20 to 30 pounds depending on its coverage. Beneath the mail, a padded garment called a gambeson absorbed some of the impact from blows and prevented the metal rings from digging into skin. In the punishing heat of the Levantan summer, this combination of padding and iron must have been almost unbearable, and there are accounts from the period describing Crusader knights suffering as much from heat exhaustion and dehydration as from enemy weapons during long marches under direct sun. Muslim commanders, notably Saladin himself, understood this vulnerability and sometimes structured their tactics around exhausting Crusader forces through harassment and heat, rather than committing to a single decisive engagement, wearing down men whose armor, so effective against direct blows, became a liability in prolonged exposure to climate. Beyond armor, a fully equipped Templar knight required multiple horses, since a single mount could not sustain the weight of an armored rider for extended campaigns without rest, and the order's rule actually specifies how many horses and squires a knight of different ranks was entitled to, along with careful regulations about how horses should be cared for, fed, and shod. This logistical burden, multiplied across hundreds of knights, helps explain why the order needed such a vast supporting economic network back in Europe. Warfare in this period was staggeringly expensive, and very little of that expense involved the dramatic clash of swords that popular retellings tend to emphasize. Most of it involved feeding horses, replacing worn equipment, and paying the enormous logistical costs of keeping men alive and functional far from home. A day ATMONTGISARD, let's slow the pace again and sit inside a single, specific day, because sometimes the most vivid way to understand a broad historical sweep is to narrow all the way down to one afternoon. On November 25th, 1177, near a place called Montgisard in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a young king afflicted with leprosy, Baldwin IV, led a crusader force that included a contingent of roughly 80 to 90 Templar knights against the far larger army of Saladin, who had believed the crusader states weakened enough to invade with confidence. Contemporary accounts describe Saladin's army as caught partially unprepared, spread out and foraging when the crusader force struck, and the resulting battle became one of the more celebrated crusader victories of the century, remembered partly because of the dramatic contrast between the teenage, physically frail king leading his men from a litter or with support, and the crushing defeat inflicted on a commander who would, only a decade later, prove himself one of the most formidable military leaders the Crusader states ever faced. The Templar contingent's cavalry charge is often credited by chroniclers as a decisive element in breaking Saladin's forces, though as with most medieval battle accounts, we should hold these details with appropriate humility, since sources from this period often exaggerated individual contributions to flatter patrons or particular factions. What's easy to lose in a summary of Montgisard is the sheer physical terror embedded in a cavalry charge of this kind. Men and horses moving at speed across uneven, rocky terrain, the deafening noise of hooves and armor and shouting voices, the near certainty that some horses would stumble and some riders would be trampled by their own advancing line before ever reaching the enemy. Soldiers who survived such engagements sometimes described, in later writings, a kind of tunnel vision, an inability afterward to reconstruct exactly what had happened in the chaos beyond a few fragmented, vivid images. This is worth remembering whenever a battle gets reduced to a name, a date, and a tidy strategic explanation. For the men actually present, it would have been closer to a few unbearably long minutes of sensory overload, followed by an exhaustion that could take days to fade. The HORNS of Hattin, if Montgisard represented the high point of Crusader military fortune, the summer of 1187 delivered its catastrophic reversal, and few battles in medieval history are remembered with quite the same grim finality as the Battle of Hattin. By this point, Saladin had unified much of the surrounding Muslim territory under his leadership, something his predecessors had never managed, and he moved against the Crusader states with a patience and strategic discipline that the fractured, often quarreling Crusader leadership struggled to match. The Crusader army, including a substantial Templar contingent under the order's Grand Master, Gerard de Riedfort, made the fateful decision to march across dry, waterless terrain toward the besieged city of Tiberias, a decision historians still argue over centuries later. Some contemporary accounts suggest Gerard de Riedfort pushed for this aggressive advance against more cautious counsel, though the full truth of who argued for what is genuinely difficult to reconstruct given how sources from this period tend to assign blame after the fact. Whatever the precise chain of decisions, the result was a Crusader force marching for hours under the brutal Levantan summer sun without adequate water, harassed constantly by Saladin's lighter, more mobile cavalry, who deliberately set fire to dry brush to add smoke and thirst to the misery of the advancing column. By the time the exhausted Crusader army reached the twin hills known as the Horns of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee, it was, by most accounts, already defeated in every sense but the final one. Dehydrated, disoriented, and surrounded, the Crusader forces made a doomed stand, and the battle ended in near total destruction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army. The relic, believed to be a piece of the true cross, carried into battle as a sacred rallying symbol, was captured by Saladin's forces and never recovered by the Crusaders, a loss that struck contemporary Christian observers as almost apocalyptic in its symbolic weight, far beyond its purely military significance. For captured Templars specifically, Hattin brought a fate distinct from other prisoners. Saladin, who generally treated captured nobility with the expectation of ransom, made a specific exception for members of the Templar and Hospitaller military orders, viewing them as uniquely dangerous ideological enemies who would simply return to the fight if released or ransomed. Contemporary Muslim and Christian sources both describe the execution of captured Templar and Hospitaller knights following the battle, and some accounts even suggest that non-military scholars present in Saladin's camp were invited to carry out these executions personally as an act of religious merit, though the details and numbers vary considerably between sources, and modern historians treat the most dramatic versions of these accounts with appropriate caution. The city Falls Jerusalem itself surrendered to Saladin in October of 1187, only months after Hattin, and this loss sent a wave of grief and urgency through European Christendom that would eventually produce the Third Crusade, the one most familiar to modern audiences through its association with King Richard the Lionheart of England and his complicated, sometimes even respectful, rivalry with Saladin himself. For the Templars, the loss of Jerusalem meant the loss of their founding headquarters, the very Temple Mount complex that had given the order its name and its earliest identity, and the order would spend the remainder of its existence never fully at home in quite the same way again, operating instead from a series of increasingly precarious coastal strongholds. It's worth noting, amid all this military drama, how Saladin's actual treatment of Jerusalem's Christian population after the surrender differed sharply from the mass slaughter the Crusaders themselves had inflicted when they took the city in 1099. Most Christian residents were permitted to leave the city upon payment of a ransom, and while this system certainly created hardship, particularly for the poorest residents who struggled to raise the required funds, historians generally regard Saladin's conduct here as comparatively restrained by the standards of medieval siege warfare, and it stands in genuinely striking contrast to the earlier Crusader conquest of the same city. The Templars regrouped along the coast, eventually establishing a new center of operations at Acre, a heavily fortified port city that would remain the last significant Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land for another century. Life in these coastal territories took on an increasingly defensive character, a slow, grinding awareness that the great sweep of territory once controlled by the Crusader states had narrowed to a thin, vulnerable strip of coastline, and that every year brought a slightly smaller version of the kingdom the founders had once imagined would last forever. A quiet moment in Acre lets pause the momentum of battles and treaties again, because a documentary that moves only from crisis to crisis eventually exhausts a listener rather than relaxing them, and this story deserves a breath here. Picture an evening in Acre sometime in the early 1200s, decades after Hattin, when the city has settled into its role as the beating commercial and military heart of what remains of the Crusader states. The harbor holds ships from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, their merchants competing fiercely for trading privileges, filling the air near the docks with a chaotic mixture of Italian dialects, Arabic, French, and the various languages of pilgrims still arriving despite everything the kingdom had lost. A Templar sergeant off duty for the evening might walk through streets that smell of salt water, tar from ship repairs, and spices unloaded from trading vessels that had called at ports the man would never see for himself, places along the Silk Road whose names he might only half remember from conversations with merchants. Candles and oil lamps flicker in windows as the light fades, and somewhere nearby, from one of the city's many churches representing a dozen different Christian traditions, a bell begins the call to evening prayer, only to be joined a moment later by another bell from a different church, then another, until the sound overlaps into something between music and noise. This is what survival looked like for the Crusader states in their final century, not the sweeping cinematic drama of a single great battle, but a smaller, stranger, more commercially vibrant existence, clinging to a narrow coastal strip while the wider world continued moving around it. Women and the Temple, myth and reality, a persistent question people bring to Templar history, involves the role or apparent absence of women within the order, and it's worth addressing directly because popular retellings often oversimplify or sensationalize this aspect of Templar life. The Rule of 1129 was explicit that the order should not accept women as members, reflecting the broader anxiety about female presence within the male monastic community that we touched on earlier. This did not mean women played no role whatsoever in the Templar world, however, and the fuller picture is more nuanced than a simple exclusion. Women appear in Templar records primarily as donors, patrons, and occasionally as tenants or dependents on Templar-controlled land, since the order's vast agricultural and financial holdings inevitably involved economic relationships with women who held property, inherited wealth, or managed estates in their husband's absence, a common situation given how many noblemen were away on crusade for years at a time. Some later revisions to Templar practice in certain regions did allow for a category of lay affiliation for women, sometimes called consorors, women who supported the order financially or through prayer without taking full monastic vows or living within Templar houses themselves, though this arrangement was neither universal nor central to how the order understood its own identity. The more sensationalized myths surrounding Templars and women, particularly the various conspiracy theories that emerged during their later trial, deserve to be separated clearly from anything resembling historical evidence, and will address those specific accusations directly when we reach the order's downfall, since understanding how those charges were manufactured tells us a great deal about the political motivations behind the Templars' eventual destruction. The last days of Acre by 1291, nearly 200 years after the First Crusade had established European Christian control in the Levant, only Acre remained of the great Crusader kingdom, and even Acre's time was running out. The Mamluk Sultanate, which had risen to power in Egypt and Syria, and proved even more relentlessly effective than Saladin's dynasty had been, moved against the city with an overwhelming siege force in the spring of that year. The defenders, including a substantial contingent of Templars under Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu, fought a defense that contemporary accounts describe as desperate and, in its final days, almost without hope. Guillaume de Beaujeu himself was killed during the fighting, struck by a crossbow bolt in an unarmored gap near his armpit while trying to rally defenders at a breached section of the wall, and his death removed one of the last steadying influences among the city's defenders during the siege's final chaotic hours. When the walls finally gave way, the fall of Acre became one of the more harrowing episodes in the entire crusading period, with civilians attempting to flee by ship in a panic that overloaded vessels and left desperate crowds on the docks with nowhere left to go as Mamluk forces entered the city. A small group of Templars reportedly held out for several more days in the order's fortified compound within the city, the last organized resistance in what had once been the capital of Crusader power in the Holy Land, before that too was overwhelmed. With the fall of Acre, nearly 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant effectively ended, and the Templars, an order founded explicitly to protect pilgrims traveling to a holy land now entirely lost to Christian control, faced an identity crisis that would prove, in hindsight, to be the beginning of the end for the entire institution, even though no one could have known it yet. An order without a home, the surviving Templars relocated their headquarters to the island of Cyprus, which remained under Crusader-aligned control, and here the order faced an uncomfortable question that it never fully resolved. What purpose does a military order dedicated to holy war in the Holy Land serve once that Holy Land is entirely lost? The Hospitallers, a comparable military order that had grown up alongside the Templars, eventually found a compelling answer by conquering and holding the island of Rhodes, giving themselves a concrete territorial mission and a continued frontier against Muslim naval power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Templars never managed an equivalent transformation. Various proposals circulated in the years after Acre's fall, including ambitious plans for a renewed crusade to retake the Holy Land, and even a specific proposal that the Templars and Hospitallers merge into a single unified military order, an idea that both organizations, protective of their separate identities and separate wealth, resisted. Without a clear ongoing military mission, the Templars increasingly appeared, at least to outside observers and to cash-strapped monarchs eyeing their vast European holdings, like an organization whose original purpose had simply expired, even as it continued controlling immense wealth and property across the continent. This is the uncomfortable position the order found itself in as the 13th century gave way to the 14th. Enormously rich, largely idle militarily, deeply entangled in the financial affairs of European monarchies, and increasingly resented by exactly the kind of powerful men who had once depended on Templar banking services, and now found themselves deeply in debt to an organization that no longer had an obvious battlefield to justify its continued existence and privileges. A king named Philip and his empty treasury, Philip IV of France, sometimes called Philip the Fair for his physical appearance rather than any particular quality of justice, inherited a kingdom whose finances were under serious strain by the early 1300s, worn down by costly wars against England and Flanders, and by his own ambitious efforts to centralize and strengthen royal authority against the traditional power of the French nobility and the Church. Philip had already demonstrated a willingness to take extraordinary measures against powerful institutions that stood in his financial way, including a dramatic and violent confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII that ended with the Pope's death shortly after being physically assaulted by Philip's agents in Italy, a scandal that shocked contemporary Europe and demonstrated just how far this particular king was prepared to go. Philip owed the Templars substantial sums, having borrowed from the order's Paris headquarters on multiple occasions, and he had also previously expelled the kingdom's Jewish population in 1306, seizing their property and outstanding debts owed to them in a move that historians widely interpret as a straightforward, if brutally executed, effort to solve a royal cash flow crisis by eliminating a group of creditors. The Templars represented a far larger and more entrenched target than the Jewish community had been, holding vastly more wealth and property, but they also carried the protection of the Pope, since the order answered directly to the papacy rather than to any national crown, a legal status that had historically shielded them from exactly the kind of seizure Philip may have been contemplating. It's worth pausing here on how genuinely unusual the Templars' legal position was within medieval Europe. Because of their direct papal charter, Templar houses were largely exempt from local taxation and from the jurisdiction of local bishops, answering instead to their own Grand Master and, ultimately, to Rome. This independence had been essential to the order's ability to operate across so many different kingdoms with a consistent internal structure, but it also meant that any king wishing to move against the Templars needed, at minimum, the cooperation or acquiescence of the Pope, since acting against a papally protected institution without such cover risked serious ecclesiastical and diplomatic consequences. A pope under pressure the Pope Philip needed to work with, or around, was Clement V, elected in 1305 under circumstances heavily influenced by French political pressure, and notably a pope who never actually traveled to Rome during his pontificate, instead establishing the papal court at Avignon in southern France, a choice that placed him geographically and politically much closer to Philip's sphere of influence than any of his predecessors had been. Whether Clement was a willing collaborator in what followed, a reluctant participant bullied into compliance, or something more complicated between those two extremes, remains one of the genuinely debated questions among historians studying this period, and the surviving evidence allows for more than one reasonable interpretation. What we do know is that in the months leading up to October 1307, Philip's government prepared a coordinated legal and military operation against the Templars with remarkable secrecy and precision, drafting sealed orders to royal officials across the Kingdom of France, orders that were not to be opened until a specific date, ensuring that the arrests, when they came, would happen simultaneously across the entire country, rather than allowing word to spread and Templars to flee or hide their assets in advance. This was, by the administrative standards of the early 14th century, an extraordinarily sophisticated and centrally coordinated operation, suggesting months of careful planning by Philip's ministers, including his chief advisor Guillaume de Nogaret, the same official who had led the physical assault against Pope Boniface VIII years earlier. Friday the 13th, on the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, royal officials across France simultaneously opened their sealed orders and moved against every Templar house within reach, arresting members of the order en masse in a single coordinated sweep that has, over the intervening 7 centuries, become permanently woven into Western superstition about the unluckiness of that particular date and day of the week combined. Even though the historical connection between Templar arrests and modern Friday the 13th superstition is more folkloric association built up over time than a direct, documented causal chain that medieval people themselves would have recognized. The charges leveled against the order were sweeping, and to modern eyes, almost absurd in their combination of specificity and implausibility. Templars were accused of requiring new initiates to deny Christ and spit upon the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, of practicing obscene kisses during these same ceremonies, of worshipping an idol sometimes described in the confessions as a bearded head called Baphomet, and of encouraging sodomy among members as an accepted practice. Taken together, these accusations mirrored, almost formulaically, a pattern of charges that medieval authorities had leveled against other groups they wished to destroy, including various heretical movements, suggesting that at least some of the specific accusations may have been drawn from a kind of standardized template of heresy accusations, rather than reflecting any genuine, independently verified practice within the Templar order itself. What makes the confessions that followed the arrests particularly difficult for historians to evaluate is the widespread and well-documented use of torture during the interrogations that followed. Contemporary records describe methods including the strupado, in which a prisoner's hands were bound behind his back and he was hoisted by a rope, dislocating his shoulders, alongside sleep deprivation, starvation, and other forms of physical coercion designed specifically to extract confessions matching the charges already prepared by the prosecution. Given these methods, the fact that a substantial number of arrested Templars did eventually confess to at least some of the charges tells us relatively little about whether the charges were true, and a great deal about how effective medieval torture was at producing whatever statement the interrogators wanted to hear. Jacques de Molay, the order's Grand Master at the time of the arrests, himself confessed under these conditions early on, a fact Philip's government publicized widely as proof of the charge's validity. What followed over the next several years was a prolonged, geographically uneven, and often contradictory legal process, as the Templars' fate became entangled in the broader political struggle between the French crown and the papacy, with individual Templars sometimes recanting confessions they had made under torture, only to be threatened with renewed torture or execution as relapsed heretics for doing so. A patchwork of justice across Europe, while the drama in France dominates most popular retellings of the Templars' downfall. It's worth remembering that the order existed across nearly the whole of Christian Europe, and the response to Philip's accusations varied dramatically from kingdom to kingdom, revealing how much the outcome depended on local political calculations rather than any universally agreed judgment about the Templars' actual guilt. In England, King Edward II initially resisted the accusations and was reluctant to move against Templars within his own territory, only doing so under sustained pressure from Philip and the papacy, and the eventual English trials produced far fewer confessions and far less severe treatment than their French counterparts, with most English Templars ultimately being absolved or transferred to other religious orders rather than executed. In the Iberian kingdoms, the picture grew even more complicated. In Aragon, some Templars actually resisted arrest militarily, holding several fortresses against royal forces for a period before eventually surrendering, and Aragonese trials generally found the accused not guilty of the specific heresy charges, even as the broader papal suppression of the order proceeded regardless of these local acquittals. Perhaps most strikingly, in Portugal, King Denis found an elegant solution that preserved much of the order's practical function while satisfying the papal dissolution. Templar assets and personnel in Portugal were essentially reconstituted under a new name, the Order of Christ, which continued many of the same activities, personnel, and even some of the same properties as the Templars had, simply operating under different institutional branding, a rebranding so successful that this new order would later fund some of Portugal's most famous age of exploration voyages, including expeditions associated with Prince Henry the Navigator. This patchwork outcome across different kingdoms tells us something important about the entire episode. This was never a unified, universally agreed judgment that the Templars had committed genuine crimes. It was far more clearly a political process whose outcome in any given territory depended heavily on how much pressure the French crown and papacy could exert locally, and how much individual monarchs had their own reasons to either preserve or dismantle Templar institutions within their own borders. The Council of Vienne and a quiet dissolution, Pope Clement V eventually convened a church council at Vienne, beginning in late 1311, ostensibly to determine the Templars' fate through proper ecclesiastical process, though by this point the outcome had arguably already been shaped by years of political pressure from Philip's government. The council itself proved contentious, with a significant number of bishops present reportedly reluctant to formally condemn the order without clearer evidence, but Clement ultimately dissolved the Templars in 1312 through a papal decree, choosing administrative suppression rather than a formal conviction on the heresy charges themselves, a distinction that mattered a great deal legally even if the practical result, the order's complete elimination, was the same either way. Most of the Templars' vast European properties were transferred to the Hospitallers, the order's longtime rival and counterpart, though in practice many monarchs, including Philip himself, managed to extract substantial fees, taxes, and outright seizures from these properties before finally allowing the transfer to proceed, meaning the French crown likely profited considerably from the whole affair, even after the primary debts that may have motivated the initial arrests were resolved. Individual Templars who had confessed and repented were generally absolved and permitted to live out their remaining years in monastic retirement, sometimes within hospitaller houses, while those who continued to maintain their innocence or who had recanted earlier confessions faced a far grimmer fate. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay himself, having confessed under torture years earlier, and then later retracted that confession, insisting on the order's innocence and his own, was condemned as a relapsed heretic, a legal category that in medieval canon law typically meant death, since recanting an admitted heresy and returning to it, or in this case reasserting innocence after confession, was treated as proof of unrepentant guilt rather than an assertion of the truth. On March 18, 1314, Molay was burned at the stake on an island in the Seine River in Paris, along with another senior Templar official, Geoffrey de Charny. The most famous story attached to Molay's execution, and it needs to be told with appropriate caution about its historical reliability, holds that as the flames rose around him, he called out a curse against both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, summoning them to join him before God's judgment within the year. What makes this story so enduring is the genuinely striking coincidence that both men did, in fact, die within roughly 12 months of Molay's execution, Clement from illness in April 1314, and Philip in a hunting accident that November. Whether Molay actually spoke these words is impossible to verify, since the earliest surviving accounts of the curse appear in chronicles written somewhat after the fact, and the story's neat, almost theatrical fulfillment has led most careful historians to treat it as a compelling legend that emerged to make sense of a striking coincidence, rather than a reliably documented historical event. It's a wonderful story to tell around a fire, and it may even be true in some form, but the honest answer is that we simply cannot know for certain, and that uncertainty is itself part of what makes this particular corner of history so endlessly discussed. Where the myths came from the Templars' abrupt, dramatic, and legally murky end left behind an unusually fertile ground for legend, and it's worth spending some time separating what later centuries imagined from what the historical record actually supports. The idea that surviving Templars fled with a secret treasure, sometimes specifically identified in later folklore as the Holy Grail or other sacred relics, has no solid contemporary evidentiary basis, though it has produced an enormous body of popular literature, from 19th century occult writings through to modern best-selling novels and their film adaptations. What the actual historical record shows is considerably less dramatic. Most Templar wealth was accounted for, seized, or transferred to the Hospitallers through the legal processes we've already discussed, even if some individual assets in specific locations were undoubtedly hidden, moved, or lost amid the chaos of the arrests, as would be expected during any sudden institutional collapse of this scale. The connection sometimes drawn between the Templars and later Freemasonry is similarly a matter of much later invention rather than documented continuity. Masonic tradition in the 18th century, particularly within certain continental European lodges, adopted Templar imagery, titles, and symbolic mythology as part of an elaborate origin story connecting Freemasonry to ancient and medieval mystical traditions. But professional historians find no credible documentary evidence of any organizational continuity between the actual medieval Templars, dissolved in 1312, and Freemasonry. which emerges as a documented institution centuries later, in a completely different social and religious context tied to medieval stonemasons' guilds rather than warrior monks. None of this means the genuine historical Templars are less interesting than their legendary descendants. If anything, the real story of 9 poor knights who became international bankers, who fought and died across 2 centuries of crusading warfare, and who were ultimately destroyed not because of secret rituals, but because a cash-strapped king needed their money and their political protection had grown too thin to save them, is a more human and in some ways more unsettling story than any secret treasure could be. What stone remembers? If you were to visit the places connected to this story today, you'd find that the Templars left behind more physical trace than their sudden dissolution might suggest. The Temple Church in London still stands in the heart of the city's legal district. Its round nave and worn stone effigies of knights open to visitors much as they were centuries ago. The same cold stone floor beneath the same round walls that once sheltered a community trying to recreate a fragment of Jerusalem in a damp northern climate. In Portugal, the Convent of Christ at Tomer preserves, layered beneath later architectural additions, the heart of what was once a major Templar stronghold. Its distinctive round church built in that same Jerusalem-inspired style we discussed earlier, now surrounded by cloisters added by the Order of Christ that inherited the site and its purpose after 1312. In the Middle East itself, the underground vaults beneath the Temple Mount, the very space where those original 9 knights likely stabled their horses in the 1120s, remain physically accessible in part today, though access is understandably restricted and politically complicated given the site's ongoing religious and political significance to multiple faiths. Archaeologists working in this region over the past century have documented Herodian-era stonework, alongside later medieval modifications that most scholars attribute to Crusader period use, offering a rare physical continuity linking the order's earliest days to its actual surviving architectural footprint, one of the few places where you can stand in a space and reasonably say that specific historical people whose names we know once stood in that same space. Doing something we can describe with real confidence. What historians still argue about its worth being honest, as we near the end of this long evening together, about how much genuine uncertainty still surrounds several aspects of this story, because presenting history as a set of tidy, settled facts does a disservice to how the discipline actually works. Historians continue to debate the precise degree of Pope Clement V's complicity in the Templars' destruction, weighing evidence that suggests both genuine reluctance and eventual capitulation against evidence suggesting closer cooperation with Philip's aims than the Pope's public statements admitted. The reliability of the confessions extracted during the trials remains a subject of careful ongoing analysis, since even setting aside confessions extracted under clear torture, some historians argue that certain irregular practices may genuinely have crept into isolated Templar houses over 2 centuries of operation, even if nothing resembling the systematic heresy described in the official charges, while others regard even this more modest possibility as unsupported speculation. There's also continued scholarly discussion about the broader question of Philip IV's true motivations, weighing financial desperation against a more ideological commitment to centralizing royal power at the expense of any institution, religious or otherwise, that operated with a degree of independence from royal authority. Most historians today favor an interpretation that combines both motives rather than treating them as mutually exclusive, recognizing that Philip's government rarely separated financial and political calculation as cleanly as modern analysis sometimes prefers to. These aren't questions with clean answers waiting to be discovered in some undiscovered archive. They're the kind of interpretive questions that make history a living conversation rather than a closed book, and that's part of what keeps historians returning to this particular story, generation after generation, even after 700 years. Ships, not just horses. When people picture the Templars, they almost always picture horses, and understandably so, given how central mounted combat was to the order's military identity. But by the middle of the 13th century, the Templars had also become a genuine maritime power, operating their own fleet of ships to move men, supplies, pilgrims, and money between Europe and the Holy Land, a fact that surprises most people hearing this story for the first time. The order maintained its own port facilities, most notably at La Rochelle on the French Atlantic coast, and Templar vessels are documented carrying pilgrims from western France directly to the eastern Mediterranean, bypassing the longer and more expensive overland routes that had exposed earlier generations of travelers to exactly the dangers the order had originally been founded to prevent. Running a fleet required an entirely different set of skills than fighting on horseback, and the Templars who managed this side of the operation would have included brothers with backgrounds in shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime trade, a reminder that the order's membership was never as uniform as the image of the armored knight suggests. A Templar ship captain moving cargo between La Rochelle and Acre needed to understand seasonal winds, the location of safe harbors along the route, and the constant threat of piracy in Mediterranean waters, none of which had anything to do with the rule's careful instructions about beards or shared dishes. Some historians have pointed to this maritime infrastructure as one of the more overlooked reasons the order accumulated such extensive wealth, since controlling transportation, much like controlling banking, put the Templars in a position to profit from nearly every stage of a pilgrim's journey, rather than simply protecting the final leg of it. There is a persistent legend, worth mentioning here specifically because it connects to the fleet, that a group of Templar ships escaped from La Rochelle in the days just before the October 1307 arrests, carrying away treasure and perhaps surviving members of the order to parts unknown, with some versions of the story sending these ships as far as Scotland or even, in wilder modern retellings, across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. No contemporary document confirms any such voyage, and the story appears to have developed and expanded considerably in later centuries, rather than emerging from evidence contemporary to the arrests themselves. It remains one of the more colorful pieces of Templar folklore, appealing precisely because it offers an escape from the grim certainty of what actually happened to most of the order's members, but it belongs, as far as the surviving historical record allows us to judge, in the category of legend rather than documented fact. Fighting for Spain, not just Jerusalem, it's easy to think of the Templars purely in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean, but the order fought an entirely separate, sustained military campaign, much closer to some of its wealthiest European estates, in the ongoing series of conflicts between Christian and Muslim kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula that historians collectively call the Reconquista. Spanish and Portuguese monarchs, eager for experienced fighting men and recognizing the same organizational discipline that had impressed observers during the Second Crusade, granted the Templars substantial frontier territories in exchange for military service defending and expanding Christian-held land against the Muslim kingdoms to the south. This Iberian dimension of Templar history often gets compressed into a footnote in popular retellings focused on Jerusalem, but it represents a genuinely distinct chapter of the order's military life, one defined less by the long sea voyages and desert campaigns of the Holy Land, and more by familiar-feeling terrain, rolling hills and river valleys not unlike parts of France, dotted with a network of Templar castles built specifically to hold contested frontier zones. The castle of Ponferrada in northern Spain, along the pilgrim route to Santiago de Compostela, still stands today as one of the more impressive surviving examples of this frontier architecture, its thick defensive walls a reminder that Templar military activity extended well beyond the more famous battlefields of the eastern Mediterranean. This Iberian presence also helps explain why the order's dissolution played out so differently in Spain and Portugal compared to France. Templars in these kingdoms were not distant, somewhat abstract absentee landlords collecting rents from afar, as they might have appeared in parts of rural England or Germany. They were an active, visible, locally integrated military presence defending real and recent frontiers, which likely contributed to the greater local reluctance to condemn them and the more inventive institutional solutions, like Portugal's Order of Christ, that emerged to preserve their practical function even after Rome ordered their dissolution. The men who never fought within every Templar community, alongside the knights and sergeants trained for combat, lived a smaller group whose role receives far less attention in popular history. The chaplains, ordained priests who had taken vows within the order specifically to serve its spiritual needs. A community of armed men living under a monastic rule required regular access to the sacraments, confession, and Mass, and Templar chaplains filled this need, distinguished from other members by their clerical status and by their exemption from the combat duties expected of knights and sergeants. Templar chaplains occupied an interesting and somewhat unusual position within the broader church hierarchy, since they were ordained clergy who nonetheless lived under a rule of military obedience to a grand master rather than a local bishop. Another example of the order's unusual degree of independence from the normal structures of medieval ecclesiastical authority. A chaplain stationed at a remote preceptory might spend decades hearing the confessions of the same small community of brothers, present at their initiations into the order and eventually present, too, at their deathbeds. A quiet, continuous thread of spiritual companionship running underneath the more dramatic military and financial history that dominates most retellings of the Templars. It's worth remembering, when picturing the interior life of a Templar community, that these men lived and died together in genuinely close quarters over years and sometimes decades, sharing meals, prayers, illness, and eventually old age within the same small circle of brothers. The order's rule, for all its careful regulation of behavior, also created something like an extended family structure for men who had, in many cases, given up their birth families entirely upon taking their vows. Whatever else historians debate about the order's later crimes or innocence, the ordinary texture of daily companionship within these communities, sustained across an entire adult lifetime for many members, represents one of the more genuinely human and often overlooked dimensions of what it meant to be a Templar. What the cross actually meant, we mentioned earlier that Pope Eugenius III granted the Templars the right to wear a red cross on their white mantles, but it's worth spending a little more time on what this symbol actually meant to the people who wore it, because modern audiences often encounter the Templar cross as a stylized logo, stripped of its original religious weight. The cross awarded to the Templars took a specific shape, with flared, expanding arms, sometimes called a cross pate, and contemporary sources describe it as a mark of the crusading vow itself, a visible sign that the wearer had committed his life to defending Christendom and had symbolically taken up the cross in the most literal possible sense. For a Templar knight, this cross was sewn onto his mantle, and its presence carried genuine social and religious weight far beyond simple identification. Wearing it marked a man as permanently set apart from ordinary secular life, a walking symbol of a vow that could not be undone the way a temporary crusading pledge, taken by an ordinary knight for a single campaign, eventually could be. Other crusading orders adopted their own colored crosses to distinguish themselves visually, the Hospitallers favoring white crosses on black or later red fields, the Teutonic Knights choosing black crosses on white, and this system of color-coded crosses served a genuinely practical battlefield function beyond mere symbolism, allowing commanders and allies to identify different contingents at a glance amid the chaos and dust of combat. When shouted commands might not carry and individual banners could be lost from sight, beyond the cross itself, Templar seals and symbols carried other meanings worth noting. We've already discussed the image of two knights on a single horse, likely reflecting genuine early poverty, but Templar seals in different regions sometimes incorporated other imagery as well, including depictions of the Dome of the Rock, which Crusaders mistakenly believed to be the actual Temple of Solomon, reinforcing that persistent thread connecting the order's identity back to Jerusalem, no matter how far its actual operations expanded across Europe. A meal at the long table. Let's slow down once more, because we've covered a great deal of ground since our last quiet pause, and this story benefits from returning, every so often, to something as simple as a meal. Picture the refectory of a mid-sized Templar preceptory somewhere in the Loire Valley on an evening in late autumn, the kind of evening when the light fades early and a fire burning in the hall's hearth becomes the most welcome thing in the room. The rules specified that brothers should eat in silence or near silence, while a designated reader recited passages from Scripture aloud, so that even the act of eating remained, in principle, a form of spiritual discipline rather than simple idle conversation. The meal itself, on a permitted meat day, might include boiled or roasted meat shared between pairs of brothers from a single dish, following the same principle of shared poverty reflected in the two knights' one-horse imagery, along with coarse bread, perhaps a thin soup or pottage thickened with whatever vegetables the preceptory's own gardens had produced that season, and watered wine, since wine was common across medieval Europe partly because water sources were often unreliable or contaminated. And the alcohol content, however diluted, offered some measure of protection against waterborne illness, even if medieval people didn't fully understand the mechanism behind that protection. Silence at meals did not mean the absence of human warmth, and it would be a mistake to picture these communities as grim or joyless simply because their formal rule emphasized discipline and restraint. Brothers who had lived together for years would have developed the kind of unspoken familiarity that comes from long shared routine, a glance exchanged across the table, a small kindness in passing the bread to an older brother whose hands had grown less steady with age. These are the details that rarely survive in official documents, which tend to record rules, transactions, and legal disputes rather than the quiet human warmth of an ordinary evening meal. But they were surely there, in some form, in nearly every one of the hundreds of Templar houses scattered across medieval Europe. Laughter behind the discipline, it would be easy, given how heavily this story leans on formal rules and grim later history, to imagine Templar life as entirely humorless, but scattered evidence suggests these communities, like any group of men living together for years, found their own outlets for humor and camaraderie within the boundaries their vows allowed. The rule itself, in fact, includes provisions addressing behavior that suggests the leadership anticipated and tried to regulate exactly this kind of informal camaraderie, including instructions against boasting about one's exploits in battle or hunting, a rule that only makes sense if some brothers were, in fact, prone to exactly that kind of storytelling around the fire after a long day. Sergeants and knights training together, sharing quarters, and depending on one another in combat would inevitably have developed the kind of rough affection and teasing familiar to soldiers in any era, even if the more solemn tone of surviving official documents rarely captures it directly. We can reasonably imagine an older sergeant ribbing a newly arrived young knight over some minor failure with a horse or a piece of equipment, the kind of good-natured hazing that helps bond new members into a military unit, even within a community that also expected its members to maintain the outward solemnity appropriate to a religious vocation. This human warmth matters for understanding why so many men chose this life, and in many cases, remained committed to it even after the orders fall from grace, choosing to maintain their innocence under threat of execution, rather than simply agreeing to whatever confession might have spared them further suffering. An institution held together purely by fear and rigid discipline rarely produces that kind of loyalty. Something more genuine, some real sense of brotherhood built across years of shared meals, shared prayer, and shared danger, must have existed underneath the formal structure the rule describes, even if the surviving documents, by their very nature, tend to record regulation rather than affection. The political climate that made the charges believable to understand why accusations as extreme as the ones leveled against the Templars in 1307 could gain any traction at all. It helps to look at the broader religious and political climate of early 14th century France, a period marked by heightened anxiety about heresy following the brutal suppression, a century earlier, of the Cathar movement in southern France. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars, launched in 1209 and continuing in various forms for decades afterward, had established both a legal and psychological framework within French society for treating heresy as an existential threat requiring extreme measures, including the systematic use of inquisitorial courts, torture, and mass execution. By the time Philip IV's government prepared its case against the Templars, France possessed an established inquisitorial apparatus and a population that had, within living memory of their grandparents' generation, witnessed the state and church cooperate to destroy an entire religious movement through exactly the combination of torture-extracted confession and mass prosecution that would soon be turned against the Templars. This context matters enormously for understanding why the specific charges against the Templars, however implausible they might seem to us now, followed such a recognizable template. Accusations of secret idol worship, obscene ritual, and sexual deviance had already proven, a century earlier, to be an effective legal and propagandistic formula for destroying a wealthy or troublesome religious group, and Philip's ministers, several of whom had backgrounds in exactly this kind of legal and inquisitorial process, appear to have drawn directly on that established playbook. This doesn't mean the charges against the Templars were simply invented wholesale with cynical calculation, though many historians believe political calculation played the dominant role. It means that the entire apparatus of accusation, interrogation, and confession that destroyed the Templars had already been tested and refined against an earlier target, and the machinery, once built, proved disturbingly easy to redirect toward whichever group a sufficiently powerful government decided to aim it at next. The humbler men of the trial history remembers Jacques de Molay because his rank and his dramatic execution made him impossible to ignore. But the overwhelming majority of Templars swept up in the October 1307 arrests were men like the one we met at the very start of this story, ordinary sergeants, farmers, and craftsmen whose names appear, if at all, only in surviving interrogation transcripts as brief, largely anonymous entries. Surviving trial records from various French dioceses preserve fragments of testimony from these lower-ranking brothers, and reading them, even across the barrier of translation and 7 centuries of distance, offers a genuinely different texture than the grand political narrative surrounding Molay and the order's senior leadership. Many of these humbler defendants described joining the order not out of grand religious ambition, but for far more practical reasons: security, a guaranteed place to live and eat, a respectable position for a younger son with limited prospects elsewhere, reasons not so different from why people join large institutions in any era. Their confessions, extracted under the same coercive conditions applied to their social superiors, often show telling inconsistencies and variations in detail from one testimony to the next, exactly the kind of inconsistency modern legal scholars would expect from coerced statements rather than accounts of a genuinely shared, coordinated ritual practice. Since real shared rituals tend to produce far more consistent descriptions across multiple witnesses than fabricated ones extracted independently under duress, it's worth remembering these men specifically because the broader historical conversation about the Templars, then and now, has always gravitated toward the dramatic figures at the top, the Grand Masters, the kings, the popes. But the actual human cost of October 1307 fell overwhelmingly on people whose names barely survive, men who had joined a respected religious order, expecting a life of quiet, structured service, and who instead found themselves, through no apparent fault of their own, caught inside a legal machine built primarily to solve one king's financial and political problems. What actually happened when a man joined? We've talked a great deal about what Templar life looked like once a man had already taken his vows, but the moment of joining itself deserves its own attention, both because the rule describes it in unusual detail, and because this exact ceremony would later become the twisted centerpiece of the fabricated charges brought against the order. According to the rule and later procedural additions known as the retries, a man seeking admission was first questioned carefully by the assembled chapter about his circumstances, since the order needed to confirm he was not already married, not in debt to another lord in a way that would create competing obligations, not already a member of another religious order, and not entering under some kind of external pressure or trickery. If accepted, the candidate would be brought before the assembled brothers, and the presiding officer would warn him plainly and repeatedly about the harshness of the life he was choosing, emphasizing that he would give up his own will entirely and belong, from that moment forward, to God and to his superiors, that he would eat coarse food, wear rough clothing, and go wherever he was sent without complaint. Historians studying these procedural texts have noted how deliberately unglamorous this framing was, almost the opposite of a recruitment pitch, designed specifically to filter out men drawn to the order for status or adventure rather than genuine commitment. Only after this discouraging warning would the candidate swear his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, receive the white mantle if he was being admitted as a knight, and be formally welcomed into the community with a kiss of peace from the presiding officer, a standard gesture of religious fraternity used across many medieval monastic traditions, and one that later prosecutors would twist without any credible supporting evidence. Into the obscene kissing rituals described in the 1307 charges. This detail matters enormously for understanding how the fabricated accusations worked as propaganda. Effective lies rarely invent something from nothing. They take an ordinary, well-documented practice, in this case a standard fraternal kiss during initiation, common across many religious communities of the period, and recast it in the most suspicious possible light, relying on the fact that the initiation ceremony itself took place privately, among members only, meaning few outsiders could immediately contradict whatever sinister interpretation prosecutors chose to impose upon it. Whether at the edge of the world, let's pause again, because it's been some time since we simply sat inside a moment rather than following an argument, and this story has earned another quiet breath. Picture a winter night at a Templar commandery in the north of England, perhaps in Yorkshire or further north still, sometime in the depths of the 13th century, long before anyone in that hall could have imagined how the order's story would eventually end. Snow has been falling since mid-afternoon, and by the time the brothers gather for Compline, the last prayer of the day, the courtyard outside lies under a smooth, undisturbed layer broken only by the tracks of whoever last crossed to check on the horses. Inside the chapel, a handful of candles provide most of the light, their flames occasionally guttering in drafts that find their way through even the most carefully built stone walls, and the brothers' breath is faintly visible in the cold air as they recite the evening office together, voices low and steady, more habit by now than conscious effort after years of the same words spoken at the same hour. Outside, the wind moves snow against the stable walls, and somewhere in the darkness a horse shifts its weight audibly, the only sound besides the prayers and the wind for the length of an entire long, quiet, ordinary winter evening at the far northern edge of an order whose founding members had once knelt in the very different heat and dust of Jerusalem. It's worth holding both of these images together, the desert heat of Hattin and this northern English snow, because the Templars existed simultaneously in both worlds for nearly 2 centuries, and no single description of climate, landscape, or daily rhythm can fully capture what it meant to belong to an order that stretched across such a vast range of geography and weather. A brother stationed in Yorkshire and a brother stationed in Acre were bound by the same vows, the same rule, the same distant chain of command, even though their daily physical experience of the world could hardly have been more different. The letter that proved they were absolved for centuries after 1312, the standard historical understanding held that Pope Clement V, whatever his private reservations, ultimately accepted the Templars' guilt, at least implicitly, by dissolving the order through administrative decree rather than formally declaring their innocence. This picture shifted in a genuinely dramatic way in 2001, when a Vatican archivist named Barbara Frail discovered a document that had been misfiled in the Vatican secret archives for roughly 7 centuries, a parchment now known as the Chinon Parchment, recording proceedings from August 1308 at the castle of Chinon in France, where papal representatives had secretly interviewed senior Templar leaders, including Jacques de Molay himself. This document reveals something historians had long suspected but could not conclusively prove, that Clement V privately absolved the Templar leadership of the heresy charges after this interrogation, treating their earlier confessions, extracted under torture, as evidence of grave but forgivable sin rather than unrepentant heresy, and formally reconciling them with the Church. The parchment was never made public at the time, and its existence appears to have been effectively buried, whether deliberately or through simple administrative confusion, allowing Philip's government to continue treating the order as guilty in the court of public opinion, even as the Pope's own private judgment, according to this document, pointed toward absolution rather than condemnation. The rediscovery of the Chinon parchment in the early 21st century represents exactly the kind of moment historians dream about, a single physical document surfacing after centuries of obscurity and genuinely reshaping scholarly understanding of a major historical episode. It doesn't resolve every question about the Templars' downfall, and it doesn't tell us definitively whether any individual Templar practice, however minor, deviated from the ideal described in the official rule. But it does provide strong documentary support for what many historians had already concluded through other evidence, that the sweeping heresy charges of 1307 were substantially a political fabrication rather than a genuine reflection of Templar belief or practice, and that the highest religious authority in Christendom privately recognized this even while publicly allowing the order's destruction to proceed. The bearded head called Baphomet, no single piece of the Templar mythology, has generated more speculation over the centuries than the idle confessions described the accused as worshipping, most commonly referred to in the trial records by a name transcribed as Baphomet, sometimes described as a bearded head, sometimes as a skull, sometimes with other bizarre and inconsistent physical details, depending on which coerced confession a modern reader happens to consult. The inconsistency itself is telling, since a genuine shared religious practice, passed down through generations of initiates, would typically produce far more consistent descriptions across different confessions than the wildly varying accounts that actually survive from the 1307 interrogations. Historians have proposed several plausible explanations for where this name and imagery came from, none of them requiring any actual secret idol to have existed. One theory holds that Baphomet represents a garbled or deliberately distorted version of Mahomet, the medieval European rendering of the name Mohammed, reflecting centuries of confused and often deliberately hostile European Christian rumor about Islamic religious practice, itself frequently and inaccurately accused of idol worship by medieval Christian polemicists who badly misunderstood Islamic theology's actual and quite strict prohibition on representational religious imagery. Under torture, a confused or desperate prisoner, prompted by leading questions from interrogators already primed to expect some kind of exotic idol, might easily produce a garbled reference along these lines, without any of it reflecting genuine Templar belief or practice. In the 19th century, long after the medieval Templars themselves had vanished, the name Baphomet was revived and given an entirely new, elaborate visual identity by the French occultist Eliphas Levi, who created a widely reproduced image combining a goat's head, human and animal features, and various esoteric symbols as an illustration for his own occult writings. An image that has since become so culturally dominant that many people today assume it represents some kind of authentic medieval Templar artifact. It does not. Levi's illustration postdates the actual Templars by over 500 years and reflects 19th century occult symbolism rather than anything from the medieval trial records. This is a particularly clear example of how later invention has layered itself over the actual historical Templars so thickly that popular imagination sometimes struggles to distinguish the genuine, if strange and coerced, 14th century confessions from purely modern additions built up over subsequent centuries. What became of the money we spent considerable time earlier describing the Templars' remarkable financial network, and it's worth returning to that thread now to ask a practical question. Where did all that wealth actually go after 1312? The formal answer decreed at the Council of Vienne was that Templar properties should transfer to the Hospitallers, the order's longtime counterpart and rival, which did in fact absorb a substantial portion of former Templar land, buildings, and other assets across much of Europe in the years following the dissolution. The practical reality proved considerably messier than the clean legal decree suggests. Local monarchs across Europe took the opportunity to extract fees, taxes, and outright confiscations from Templar property before allowing any transfer to proceed, meaning the Hospitallers frequently received former Templar assets only after years of negotiation, and often at reduced value compared to what the property had been worth under Templar management. Philip IV's own government, despite having initiated the entire process partly to solve a financial crisis, appears to have profited substantially from the process of managing, taxing, and gradually releasing former Templar assets within French territory, even though the original debts that may have motivated his actions were, in the end, a relatively modest portion of the total wealth that changed hands. In some regions, the transfer to the Hospitallers never fully materialized in practice, with local nobility or crown officials retaining effective control over former Templar land through various legal and administrative maneuvers that outlasted the initial dissolution decree by years or even decades. This messy, uneven, drawn-out process of asset transfer offers one more piece of evidence supporting the broader historical interpretation that the Templars' destruction was driven substantially by material and political motives rather than genuine religious conviction about their guilt, since a purely religious or moral concern about heresy would have no obvious reason to produce such an extended, financially self-interested scramble over the practical spoils of the order's collapse. Neighbors, not just enemies, it would be a mistake, in a story this heavily shaped by crusading warfare, to imagine the Templars' relationship with the surrounding Muslim world as one of unbroken hostility. The reality on the ground in the Crusader states was considerably more complicated, shaped by decades of proximity, trade, and the practical necessities of survival in a region where Christian and Muslim powers frequently needed to negotiate, form temporary alliances, and manage disputes short of open war. Templar commanders in the Holy Land sometimes maintained working relationships and even a degree of mutual respect with specific Muslim rulers and military leaders, relationships that occasionally puzzled or scandalized more recently arrived crusaders from Europe, who often held far more simplistic and hostile views of the enemy than the veteran Templars who had spent years or decades actually living in the region. One particularly well-documented example involves the Nizari Ismaili group, often called the Assassins by medieval European sources, a distinct Muslim sect with its own network of mountain fortresses in Syria, which maintained a complex relationship with the Templars involving periods of open conflict, alongside periods of tribute payment, and even occasional strategic cooperation against shared enemies. The Templars' network of fortresses in the Syrian frontier region put them in frequent, unavoidable contact with this group, and surviving accounts describe negotiations, tribute arrangements, and diplomatic exchanges that reflect a far more pragmatic, transactional relationship than the simple religious warfare narrative usually associated with crusading history. This complexity matters because it reminds us that the people living through this history, on every side, were rarely as simply motivated as later, more ideologically simplified retellings suggest. A Templar commander stationed at a frontier fortress for years needed practical relationships with his neighbors, whatever their faith, simply to keep his garrison fed, his water supply secure, and his territory reasonably stable. And the historical record, when examined closely, shows exactly this kind of pragmatic accommodation existing alongside the genuine religious conviction and periodic brutal violence that also, undeniably, characterized this long and difficult chapter of medieval history. Healing hands within a warrior order, though the Hospitallers are far better remembered for medical care, having grown directly out of a hospital foundation in Jerusalem and maintaining an extensive network of hospitals throughout their history. The Templars also maintained some capacity for treating sick and injured brothers, since any organization moving large numbers of men across long distances and into combat inevitably needed some means of caring for the wounded and the ill. Templar houses of sufficient size sometimes included an infirmary, and the order's rule includes provisions addressing the care owed to sick brothers, instructing that they should receive meat and other necessary comforts beyond what the ordinary rule permitted healthy members, a recognition that the general discipline of poverty needed to bend somewhat in the face of genuine physical suffering. Medical knowledge available to a Templar infirmarian in this period remained, by modern standards, extremely limited, grounded in the humoral theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine, which understood illness as an imbalance among four bodily fluids, and treatment often involved bloodletting, dietary adjustment, and herbal remedies whose effectiveness varied enormously depending on the specific ailment and the specific remedy applied. Wounds from combat, when they didn't kill immediately, still carried an enormous risk of fatal infection given the complete absence of any understanding of germ theory, and a knight who survived a battlefield injury still faced weeks of genuine uncertainty about whether the wound would heal cleanly or turn fatally septic. Despite these limitations, contact with the more medically sophisticated Islamic world, which had preserved and expanded upon much of ancient Greek and Roman medical knowledge during the centuries when this knowledge had been largely lost in Western Europe, gradually introduced some crusaders and the orders operating in the Levant to more advanced medical practices than what had been available back home. This exchange of medical knowledge represents one of the quieter, less dramatic, but genuinely significant consequences of the prolonged Christian and Muslim contact in the crusading period, a reminder that cultural exchange happened even amid sustained military conflict, carried not through treaties or battles, but through the more mundane channels of captured physicians, translated texts, and the simple accumulated observation of soldiers who noticed, over years of proximity, that their opponents sometimes treated wounds more effectively than they did themselves. A chapel in Scotland among the many legends that have attached themselves to the Templars over the centuries, few have proven as persistently popular as the various theories connecting the order to Rosslyn Chapel, an ornately carved 15th-century chapel near Edinburgh, Scotland, built by the Sinclair family more than a century after the Templars' official dissolution in 1312. The chapel's genuinely remarkable and unusual stone carvings, which include an enormous variety of botanical, biblical, and symbolic imagery, have inspired generations of speculation connecting the building to surviving Templar traditions, hidden treasure, or even more elaborate claims involving the Holy Grail, claims that gained enormous popular circulation through late 20th and early 21st century books and films, built around exactly this kind of speculative connection. The historical problem with these theories is fairly straightforward. Rosslyn Chapel's construction began in 1446, well over a century after the Templar Order had ceased to exist as a formal institution, and no credible contemporary documentation connects the Sinclair family's building project to any surviving Templar organization or tradition. The specific carvings most often cited as evidence of secret Templar symbolism, including depictions sometimes interpreted as New World plants supposedly proving pre-Columbian contact with the Americas, have been re-examined by botanists and art historians who generally identify these images as conventional medieval European decorative motifs. Stylized foliage patterns common in Gothic architecture of the period, rather than accurate botanical depictions of any specific plant species. None of this careful historical correction has done much to slow the popular appeal of the Rosslyn theories, and it's worth understanding why such stories persist even after historians have addressed them directly and repeatedly. Mystery is genuinely pleasurable, and a story involving secret knowledge, hidden treasure, and a suppressed order surviving underground across centuries offers a more emotionally satisfying narrative than the more mundane, if arguably more remarkable, actual historical truth. That an extraordinarily wealthy and powerful medieval institution was destroyed through entirely ordinary human motives, greed and political calculation, and that its actual physical legacy survives mostly in scattered archives, worn stone effigies, and the quiet ruins of preceptories rather than in any secret, continuously operating underground network. A widow's gift. Let's return, before we move toward this story's final chapters, to the ordinary people whose lives touched the Templars without ever wearing the white mantle themselves, because their stories help complete the picture of what this order actually meant within medieval society. Surviving charters from Templar archives across Europe preserve records of countless donations made not by kings or great nobles, but by ordinary landholders, and among these, records of donations made by widows appear with notable frequency. Women who, having inherited land or property from a deceased husband, chose to grant some portion of it to the Templars in exchange for prayers to be said for their husband's soul, and often for their own future spiritual benefit as well. One such surviving charter from a Templar house in the Champagne region of France records a widow granting a portion of vineyard land to the order specifically in memory of her husband, who had died without ever completing a crusading vow he had made years earlier, a common and genuinely poignant situation in medieval society, where men frequently swore to go on crusade and then died through illness, accident, or simple lack of resources before ever fulfilling that vow. Donating to the Templars offered these families a way to symbolically complete an unfulfilled spiritual obligation, transferring the merit of supporting the crusading cause from the deceased husband, who could no longer act, to the surviving widow who could. These small, individually modest donations, multiplied across hundreds of similar transactions throughout Templar archives, tell us something important about how deeply the crusading ideal had penetrated ordinary medieval life, well beyond the relatively small number of men who actually took up arms and traveled east. For every knight who rode to Jerusalem, there existed an entire web of family members, neighbors, and local communities back home who participated in the crusading project indirectly, through prayer, through donation, through the quiet, unglamorous work of supporting an institution whose distant activities they would likely never witness firsthand, but whose success or failure they nonetheless understood as bound up with their own spiritual fate. Life in exile on Cyprus. After the catastrophic loss of Acre in 1291, the surviving Templar leadership relocated to Cyprus, an island that had passed under Crusader control over a century earlier and now became, somewhat awkwardly, the Order's new center of operations, a headquarters in exile rather than the confident capital the Temple Mount had once represented. Life on Cyprus for the relocated order carried a distinctly different character than the frontier existence the Templars had known in the Holy Land, since the island offered relative physical safety from the kind of direct military threat that had defined the final desperate decades in the Crusader states, even as it left the order without the clear military mission that had originally justified its existence. Templar holdings on Cyprus included agricultural estates producing sugar, a crop increasingly valuable in European trade, and one that Crusader-era contact with the Eastern Mediterranean had helped introduce more widely into European commerce and cuisine. Along with vineyards producing the sweet wines the island remained known for centuries afterward. Brothers stationed here found themselves managing plantation-style agricultural operations, quite different from the more modest farming and rent collection duties typical of a rural European preceptory, in a climate and economic context shaped heavily by the island's position as a trading crossroads between Europe, the remaining Christian territories, and the wider Mediterranean world. This period of Cypriot exile, roughly the 2 decades between the fall of Acre and the beginning of the French arrests, represents one of the more genuinely uncertain chapters in the Order's history, a time when the Templars possessed enormous wealth and a still intact institutional structure, but lacked any clear answer to the question that mattered most for their long-term survival. What exactly was this order for, now that the Holy Land it had been founded to defend was entirely lost? The Hospitallers answered this question through their eventual conquest of Rhodes, giving themselves a concrete new mission as a naval and territorial power. The Templars, for reasons historians still debate, including possible internal disagreement about strategy and a costly attachment to eventually retaking the Holy Land rather than adapting to a genuinely new mission, never found an equivalent answer, and this unresolved uncertainty about institutional purpose likely made the order more vulnerable, not less, when Philip IV's government began looking for a target. A papacy far from Rome. We touched earlier on Pope Clement V's decision to establish the papal court at Avignon rather than Rome, but this decision deserves a bit more context, because it reflects a broader crisis of papal authority and independence that forms an essential backdrop to understanding how Philip IV managed to exert such extraordinary pressure over the Templars' fate. The confrontation between Philip and Clement's predecessor, Pope Boniface VIII, had ended in the Pope's physical humiliation and death, a genuinely shocking demonstration that the French crown, when sufficiently motivated, was willing to use direct force against the papacy itself, something that would have seemed almost unthinkable to earlier generations who had watched popes successfully humble emperors and kings through spiritual authority alone. Clement V's election in 1305, achieved with substantial French political influence behind it, and his subsequent decision never to relocate to Rome, instead establishing what would become a nearly 70-year period of papal residence in Avignon, reflected a genuine and lasting shift in the balance of power between the French crown and the papacy. A pope operating from Avignon, within relatively easy reach of French royal authority, and dependent in various ways on French political goodwill, occupied a fundamentally weaker negotiating position than his predecessors had enjoyed when operating from Rome, geographically and politically more distant from any single kingdom's direct influence. This context helps explain why Clement, whatever his private reservations about the Templar charges, ultimately allowed Philip's process against the order to proceed largely unchallenged for years, even as he occasionally attempted, through various procedural delays and interventions, to slow the process or preserve some jurisdiction over the final judgment, rather than simply allowing Philip's own royal courts to decide the order's fate entirely. The Templars, in this sense, became one of the more visible casualties of a much larger structural shift in medieval European power, the gradual weakening of universal papal authority relative to increasingly centralized and assertive national monarchies, a shift that would continue reshaping European politics for centuries after the Templars themselves had been forgotten by all but historians and storytellers. What 7 centuries of imagination built its worth taking a step back, near the end of this long evening, to consider why the Knights Templar specifically, out of all the various military and religious orders of medieval Europe, became such an enduring subject of popular fascination, spawning centuries of novels, films, secret societies claiming spiritual descent, and an entire subgenre of conspiracy literature that shows no sign of slowing down even 700 years after the order's actual dissolution. Part of the answer surely lies in the genuinely dramatic shape of the historical story itself, an order that rose from 9 impoverished knights to become one of medieval Europe's wealthiest and most powerful institutions, only to be destroyed suddenly and completely through a combination of torture, political calculation, and a king's desperate need for cash, offers a narrative arc that requires very little embellishment to feel compelling. But part of the answer also lies in the specific nature of how the order ended, through a dramatic mass arrest, secretive interrogations, extracted confessions, and an official dissolution that left behind genuinely unresolved legal and factual questions, rather than a clean, universally accepted resolution. Institutions that fade away gradually, through slow financial decline or peaceful voluntary dissolution, rarely generate the same enduring popular fascination as institutions destroyed abruptly amid controversy and unresolved mystery. And the Templars' end checked every box required for exactly this kind of lasting cultural resonance, further amplified by the genuine historical uncertainty that persisted for centuries about exactly how much of the original charges held any truth. The modern explosion of Templar-related fiction, from 19th century Masonic mythology through 20th century occult literature to 21st century best-selling novels and their film adaptations, has undoubtedly generated tremendous popular interest in this history, even as much of that fiction has also, unfortunately, blurred the line between documented historical fact and pure invention for a great many casual readers and viewers. Part of what this evening has tried to do is walk that line carefully, giving the genuinely remarkable true story its full due, the poverty and the wealth, the piety and the violence, the political calculation and the human tragedy, without needing to borrow from the secret treasures and hidden bloodlines that popular fiction has layered on top of it, because the documented reality, examined closely and honestly, turns out to be more than interesting enough on its own terms. A candle goes out slowly before we return, finally, to the man we began this evening with. Let's spend one more quiet moment simply sitting with an image, because this story has moved across so much geography and so many centuries that it deserves one final unhurried pause. Picture a single candle burning in an otherwise dark chapel, somewhere in rural France, on the evening the news arrived that the Grand Master of the Templars had been arrested in Paris. We don't know exactly how this news traveled, or how quickly, in an age before printing presses or rapid communication, but word of an event this significant would eventually have reached even the most remote preceptories, carried by travelers, by merchants passing through, by the ordinary slow circulation of news that characterized medieval communication. Somewhere a brother who had spent 30 years of his life within the order, who had taken his vows as a young man and grown old within the same small community of fellow brothers, would have heard this news and understood, with whatever mixture of fear, confusion, and disbelief such a moment might produce, that everything he had built his adult life around now stood in genuine danger of disappearing entirely. We can't know his name. We can't know whether he lived to see the order's final dissolution 5 years later, or whether he died first, spared at least the knowledge of how completely his world would eventually be dismantled. But he existed, almost certainly, in some preceptory somewhere, on some particular evening, watching a candle burn low while the news of Paris settled slowly over him, and that quiet, unrecorded moment of dawning uncertainty is as real a piece of this history as any battle or any papal decree, even though no document anywhere preserves his name or his exact thoughts that night. Lending money without calling it lending, we described earlier how the Templars developed a sophisticated system of letters of credit and international money transfer, but there's a specific theological and legal problem worth unpacking, because it shaped exactly how the order structured its financial dealings. Medieval church doctrine strictly prohibited usury, defined broadly as charging interest on a loan, viewed as a sin because it allowed a lender to profit from the mere passage of time rather than from any productive labor or genuine risk, a concept that put fairly severe limits on how openly any Christian institution, let alone a religious order bound by vows, could engage in what we would today simply call banking. The Templars, along with other medieval financial innovators, developed various workarounds to this prohibition that allowed them to profit from lending money without technically charging interest in a form that could be easily identified and condemned as usury. One common method involved charging fees for currency exchange or for the administrative service of transferring funds between locations, services that carried genuine costs and risks, such as fluctuating exchange rates and the danger of loss in transit, that justified a fee without that fee being labeled interest on a straightforward loan. Another method involved structuring an agreement so that a borrower would receive a smaller sum immediately, but was recorded as owing a larger sum for repayment at a future date, with the difference functioning economically identical to interest while remaining, on paper, a fixed debt amount agreed upon in advance rather than an ongoing interest charge. These arrangements required careful legal drafting and a level of financial sophistication that historians studying surviving Templar financial documents have found genuinely impressive for the period, reflecting an institution that had developed real expertise in navigating the gap between religious prohibition and practical financial necessity. It's worth noting that this same tension between religious doctrine and financial practice would continue shaping European economic development for centuries after the Templars themselves had disappeared, as merchants, bankers, and eventually entire nations, continued developing increasingly sophisticated methods of profiting from lending, while maintaining at least a technical distance from the specific sin the Church had condemned so clearly. Digging up the past, modern archaeology has added genuine texture and occasional surprise to our understanding of Templar daily life, supplementing the written record with physical evidence that sometimes confirms and sometimes complicates what the documents alone suggest. Excavations at various former Templar sites across Europe have uncovered building foundations, coin hoards, agricultural tools, and in some cases, human remains that allow researchers to study the actual physical health and lifestyle of Templar community members through skeletal analysis, revealing details about diet, physical labor, and occasionally the specific injuries that ended a particular life, information no written chronicle could ever have preserved with this kind of direct physical certainty. One particularly notable area of ongoing archaeological interest involves the underground spaces beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, sometimes referred to in popular accounts as Solomon's Stables, though this name reflects medieval Crusader belief rather than any actual connection to the biblical king, since the vaulted structure was actually built by Herod the Great over 1,000 years after Solomon's traditional era. Excavation and access in this particular location remains politically sensitive given its ongoing religious significance to multiple faiths, meaning archaeological work here has proceeded more cautiously and with more restricted access than at many other historical sites, but the surviving structure itself, with its Herodian-era stonework still visible beneath later Crusader modifications, offers a rare physical continuity linking the actual founding location of the order to its surviving architectural footprint today. Excavations at smaller, less politically sensitive Templar Preceptory sites across rural England and France have generally confirmed the picture suggested by surviving rule documents and financial records, communities that lived with genuine but modest material comfort, well-built but not luxurious structures, and agricultural operations that functioned as productive, professionally managed estates rather than either grinding poverty or extravagant wealth concentrated at the individual level. This archaeological confirmation matters because it helps historians distinguish between the order's genuine collective wealth, undeniably vast when totaled across all its European holdings, and the actual daily material experience of individual brothers, which appears to have remained considerably more modest and consistent with the poverty vows the rule required, at least at the level of ordinary rank and file members rather than senior leadership. The white cloth and who made it, we've discussed what the Templar mantle symbolized, but it's worth considering, for a moment, the actual physical process required to produce it, since medieval textile production was an enormously labor-intensive undertaking that rarely receives attention in accounts focused on battles and politics. Producing the white wool cloth used for a knight's mantle required raw wool, likely sourced in significant quantities from the order's own extensive sheep farming operations across England and elsewhere in Europe, an industry the Templars, like many other major medieval landholders, participated in as a significant source of income beyond their more famous banking activities. Turning raw wool into finished cloth involved a lengthy sequence of skilled labor. Cleaning and carding the wool to align its fibers, spinning it into thread, weaving the thread into cloth on a loom, and then fulling the finished fabric, a process involving pounding and treating the cloth with substances that could include stale urine, historically a common and effective source of the ammonia needed to help clean and felt wool fibers, a detail modern audiences often find surprising given how far removed it seems from the pristine ceremonial image of a Templar's white mantle in popular imagination. Only after this lengthy process would the cloth be ready for cutting and sewing into the actual garment, with the distinctive red cross added separately, likely appliqued or embroidered onto the finished mantle by skilled needle workers. This entire production chain, from sheep pasture to finished ceremonial garment, involved dozens of different workers with specialized skills, most of whom were never Templars themselves, but rather laborers, spinners, weavers, and tailors working within or alongside the order's broader economic network. It's a useful reminder that the visually striking image of the white-mantled knight, so central to how popular imagination pictures the Templars, actually represents the endpoint of an extensive, largely invisible economic and manufacturing process involving far more ordinary working people than the relatively small number of knights who ultimately wore the finished garment into battle or ceremony. The sound of a chapter meeting beyond the daily rhythm of prayer and labor, Templar communities held regular chapter meetings, formal gatherings where the local commander addressed the assembled brothers, announced decisions from higher authority, heard confessions of rule violations, and administered discipline for infractions ranging from minor breaches of etiquette to more serious offenses that could result in temporary expulsion from the order or other significant penalties. These meetings followed a fairly standardized format described in the order's procedural texts, beginning with prayers, followed by any necessary announcements, and then moving into what was likely the most tense portion of the proceedings for many brothers present, the opportunity, and in some cases the obligation, for members to confess violations of the rule either committed by themselves or witnessed in others. Picture the specific sound and atmosphere of such a gathering, held in whatever hall or chapter room a given preceptory maintained for this purpose, the assembled brothers seated according to rank and seniority, the commander's voice carrying through a room that would otherwise have been unusually quiet compared to the more casual conversation of an ordinary meal or work period. A brother called to confess some infraction, perhaps losing his temper with another member, or failing to properly care for his horse, or some more serious lapse in the strict standards of personal conduct the rule demanded, would have faced this admission in front of the entire assembled community, a form of accountability considerably more public and immediate than the private confession offered to a chaplain. Punishments for various infractions ranged from additional prayers or fasting for minor offenses up to expulsion from the order for the most serious violations, including such offenses as striking a fellow Christian in anger, various forms of dishonesty, or abandoning one's post in battle. This last offense treated with particular severity, given how directly it threatened the safety of fellow brothers in combat. This system of regular, public, communal discipline reinforced the order's emphasis on collective identity and mutual accountability, a structural feature that helps explain the remarkable internal cohesion the Templars maintained across 2 centuries and dozens of countries, even as it also, inevitably, produced genuine friction and occasional resentment among brothers subjected to public correction for what might have felt, to the individual involved, like a relatively minor lapse. Choosing a Grand Master, the Templars' highest office, the Grand Master, was filled through an election process described in careful procedural detail in the order's later governing texts, a system designed specifically to prevent any single faction or region from simply installing a favored candidate through raw political maneuvering. Upon the death or removal of a sitting Grand Master, a specially constituted electoral commission would be assembled, beginning with a small initial group of senior brothers, who would then progressively expand the electoral body by each nominating additional participants. A layered process intended to produce a broadly representative group, reflecting the order's geographic and institutional diversity, rather than concentrating the decision in the hands of whichever brothers happened to be physically present at the moment of the vacancy. This electoral commission, once fully assembled, would then deliberate and vote, with the specific mechanics designed to prevent open campaigning or the kind of factional politicking that could destabilize an institution operating across such a vast geographic area. Once elected, a Grand Master held his position for life, a system that provided institutional stability, but also meant that an aging or increasingly ineffective leader could remain in office for years without any formal mechanism for replacement short of death, a governance limitation that some historians have pointed to as a genuine structural weakness during the order's final decades, when younger. More dynamic leadership might conceivably have found more effective ways to adapt the order's mission after the loss of the Holy Land. Jacques de Molay himself was elected Grand Master around 1292, in the immediate aftermath of the catastrophic loss of Acre, inheriting an order facing exactly the kind of existential identity crisis we discussed earlier regarding the uncertain purpose of a crusading institution with no more crusading territory left to defend. Molay's specific leadership choices during his roughly 15 years in office, including his continued advocacy for an eventual new crusade to retake the Holy Land rather than pursuing the kind of alternative territorial mission the Hospitallers found on Rhodes, remain a subject of historical debate, with some scholars viewing this as a failure of imaginative leadership and others viewing it as a reasonable and faithful continuation of the order's original founding purpose, one that Molay, given his formation and the expectations of his brothers, would have had little practical alternative to pursuing. A relic worth mentioning carefully among the more speculative theories connecting the Templars to broader medieval religious history involves a proposed link between the order and the Shroud of Turin, the famous linen cloth bearing a faint image often associated with claims of having wrapped the body of Christ, and whose actual origin and dating remain genuinely disputed among researchers. With radiocarbon testing conducted in 1988 dating the cloth's fibers to a range within the medieval period, a finding some researchers have since questioned on methodological grounds, while others regard it as reasonably conclusive, leaving the shroud's precise origin as one of the more contested questions in the broader field of relic authentication. The theory connecting the Templars specifically to the shroud generally proposes that the order somehow acquired the relic during the crusading period, and secretly kept or transported it before its documented reappearance in France in the mid-14th century, sometimes tied to broader speculation about the Baphomet confessions representing a garbled description of secret shroud veneration rather than any genuine idol. This remains speculative rather than documented, since no contemporary Templar source describes possession of any such relic, and the connection appears to rest primarily on the general pattern of associating the Templars with any medieval mystery involving secrecy, relics, or the Eastern Mediterranean, rather than on any specific piece of corroborating evidence from Templar archives or trial records themselves. It's worth mentioning this theory specifically as an example of how the Templars' genuine historical mystery, the real uncertainty surrounding aspects of their trial and dissolution, has made them a kind of magnetic explanation for a wide range of otherwise unrelated historical puzzles, from the shroud's origin to unrelated legends about hidden treasure or secret societies. When a historical episode contains genuine, documented gaps and uncertainties, as the Templar story certainly does, it becomes an appealing vessel for explaining other unrelated mysteries as well, even when the actual evidentiary connection between the two puzzles remains thin or entirely absent. What might have been historians generally avoid excessive speculation about alternate historical paths not actually taken, since this kind of counterfactual exercise can easily slide into unfounded fantasy rather than grounded analysis. But it's worth briefly considering, in a careful and limited way, how differently European history might have unfolded had the Templars survived Philip IV's assault in some form. Since this exercise can actually help clarify what made the actual historical outcome so consequential rather than simply inevitable. Had Clement V possessed either the independence or the will to resist Philip's pressure more forcefully, perhaps relocating his court somewhere less vulnerable to direct French influence, the Templars might conceivably have survived as an institution, whether continuing in something resembling their original form or transforming, as the Hospitallers eventually did, into a differently focused military and financial power. A surviving Templar order might have continued serving as one of medieval Europe's primary international banking networks well into the following centuries, potentially competing with or shaping the eventual rise of Italian banking families like the Medici, who would come to dominate European high finance in the century following the Templars' actual dissolution. Alternatively, a surviving order might have found itself drawn into the increasingly nationalist and centralizing tendencies of emerging European monarchies in ways that could have compromised its independence regardless of whether Philip's specific 1307 assault had succeeded, since the broader historical trend towards stronger national monarchies and weaker transnational institutions, including eventually the papacy itself, was already well underway and would likely have continued reshaping the Templars' position even absent this particular crisis. This kind of counterfactual thinking ultimately underscores something important about the actual historical Templars. Their destruction was not some inevitable, foreordained consequence of institutional obsolescence following the loss of the Holy Land, but rather the specific, contingent result of one king's particular financial desperation, intersecting with one pope's particular political vulnerability at one specific moment in the early 14th century. Change either of those specific variables, and this story might easily have unfolded quite differently. A reminder that even institutions as seemingly permanent and powerful as the medieval Templars ultimately depended on the same fragile, contingent chain of individual human decisions that shapes every other chapter of history. What the parchment smelled like. Let's return, one final time before we close, to something purely sensory, because this evening has covered enormous ground across centuries and continents, and it deserves to end the way it began, grounded in something small and physical rather than abstract. Picture a Templar scribe, somewhere in a preceptory archive room, updating a rent roll or copying a charter by candlelight, the particular smell of a medieval scriptorium filling the small space around him, a mixture of the animal-based ink he worked with, the slightly sour tang of the vellum itself, prepared from treated animal skin through a process the scribe likely never thought much about, since it had simply always been the material his work was recorded upon, and the warm, slightly smoky smell of the candle providing his only light on a dim afternoon. His hand would move steadily across the page, recording details that seemed, at the time, entirely mundane. Which tenant owed how much grain this season, which brother had been transferred to which preceptory, which piece of land had recently been donated by which local family. He had no way of knowing that centuries later, historians in an unimaginably different world would pore over exactly these kinds of mundane records, extracting from them the patient, careful reconstruction of daily medieval life that this very evening's story has depended upon at every turn. The grand narrative of kings, popes, and burning stakes that dominates popular memory of the Templars rests, in the end, on the accumulated weight of thousands of these small, unglamorous, careful acts of record-keeping, performed by scribes whose names we mostly don't know, in rooms that smelled of candle smoke and prepared animal skin, on ordinary afternoons that felt, to the men living through them, like nothing more than another day's work. A different kind of warrior monk, it's worth comparing the Templars briefly to the Teutonic Knights, a third major military order founded somewhat later, around 1190, originally to provide medical care to German-speaking crusaders, before evolving into a formidable military organization in its own right, because the contrast helps clarify what made the Templars' particular trajectory distinctive. Where the Templars remained primarily focused on the Eastern Mediterranean throughout most of their existence, the Teutonic Knights eventually redirected the bulk of their military energy toward the Baltic region of Northern Europe, conducting a prolonged and often brutal series of campaigns against pagan Baltic peoples, eventually carving out an independent territorial state in what is now Poland and the Baltic states. A genuinely sovereign political entity ruled directly by the order itself, rather than existing merely as a landholder within someone else's kingdom. This territorial state, sometimes called the state of the Teutonic Order, gave the Teutonic Knights a completely different institutional trajectory than either the Templars or the Hospitallers, since they answered to no external king for this territory and functioned, in effect, as their own sovereign government complete with the administrative, legal, and diplomatic apparatus that implies. This arrangement offered the Teutonic Knights a degree of long-term security and independence the Templars never achieved, since no external monarch possessed the same kind of leverage over Teutonic assets that Philip IV was able to exercise over Templar property within his own kingdom's borders. And the Teutonic Order, unlike the Templars, survived the 14th century entirely intact, continuing to exist in various transformed institutional forms for centuries afterward. This comparison highlights something genuinely important about why the Templars specifically proved vulnerable in ways that comparable military orders did not. Their wealth and property existed primarily as landholdings scattered across the sovereign territory of other rulers, dependent ultimately on the goodwill and restraint of kings like Philip, who had every legal and practical capacity to seize that property whenever sufficient political will and justification could be assembled. The Teutonic Knights, by carving out actual sovereign territory of their own, and the Hospitallers, by eventually securing their own island base at Rhodes and later Malta, both achieved a form of institutional independence and territorial security that the Templars, for whatever combination of strategic choice and historical circumstance, never managed to replicate for themselves. Children given to God, one aspect of medieval religious life that modern audiences sometimes find difficult to fully absorb, involves the practice of oblation, the custom by which parents dedicated young children to religious life, sometimes placing them within monastic communities at ages as young as 7 or 8, well before the child could meaningfully consent to such a permanent commitment by modern standards. While the Templars' rule generally emphasized recruiting adult men capable of combat rather than raising child oblates from infancy in the manner of some older Benedictine monastic traditions, the broader medieval practice of oblation still shaped the social and religious context within which families made decisions about which sons might eventually join a military order like the Templars. A family with several sons and limited land to divide among them faced genuine practical pressure to find alternative paths for younger sons who would not inherit the family estate, and dedicating a son to religious life, whether through actual childhood oblation to a monastery or through eventual adult enrollment in an order like the Templars, offered families an honorable solution to this common medieval inheritance problem. Some Templar recruits likely arrived at this vocation having spent years already immersed in religious education, perhaps within a monastery as children before eventually transferring, upon reaching appropriate age, into the more overtly military vocation the Templars represented, a pathway that combined the family's need to provide for a son with the religious prestige of dedicating that son's life to God's service. This context helps explain why the order could draw so effectively on family networks and inherited social expectations for its recruitment, since joining the Templars was rarely, for a medieval nobleman's son, an entirely individual or spontaneous decision made independently by the young man himself. It existed within a broader, deeply entrenched social system in which families actively planned and shaped the religious and vocational paths of their children from a very young age, with the eventual adult decision to take Templar vows representing, in many cases, the culmination of years of family expectation and preparation, rather than a sudden, purely personal spiritual awakening occurring independently in adulthood. What a village lost. When we think about the Templars' dissolution, we naturally focus on the arrested brothers themselves, the knights and sergeants who faced torture, interrogation, and in some cases execution. But it's worth considering, for a moment, the effect this sudden institutional collapse had on the ordinary villages and tenant communities that had lived under Templar landlordship for generations. Since the order's dissolution represented, for these communities, not primarily a religious or political drama, but a genuinely disruptive change in the basic economic and administrative structure of their daily lives. A village whose land belonged to a Templar preceptory had developed, over decades or even a century or more, a specific working relationship with that institution, understanding its particular rent structures, its specific expectations regarding labor obligations, and its established patterns of local governance and dispute resolution. When Templar property transferred, often after considerable delay and legal confusion, to the Hospitallers or to whichever local authority ultimately absorbed it, tenant communities faced a period of genuine uncertainty about whether existing agreements would be honored, whether familiar administrators would remain in place, and whether the basic terms of their economic life would continue unchanged or shift in ways beyond their control or even their knowledge. Surviving records suggest this transition proceeded with considerable local variation, with some Hospitaller administrators apparently maintaining existing Templar arrangements with minimal disruption, while other transitions produced documented disputes over rents, boundaries, and obligations that had been clearly understood under Templar management, but became contested once new authorities took over. For the ordinary tenant farmer or village craftsman living on former Templar land, the dramatic political and religious questions occupying kings and popes in Paris and Avignon mattered considerably less than the immediate practical question of whether his family's livelihood and legal standing would survive the transition intact, a genuinely human concern that the grand historical narrative of heresy trials and papal politics rarely pauses to consider, but one that surely occupied the minds of thousands of ordinary people across Europe during these same uncertain years. The language of the records, a small but genuinely interesting detail about how we know what we know, involves the actual languages in which Templar records survive, since the order operated across a linguistic landscape considerably more varied than modern national borders might suggest. Official church documents and much internal correspondence used Latin, the standard language of medieval educated communication across Christian Europe, but the original rule of the order, along with many of the later procedural additions known as the retrises, were actually composed in Old French, the vernacular language of the order's founding region and its most numerous membership, a choice that reflected the practical reality that many knights, even noble ones, possessed only limited formal Latin education compared to the clergy. This linguistic mixture created interesting layers of translation and interpretation that modern historians must navigate carefully, since a document's original language sometimes affects how precisely certain technical or legal terms can be understood, and the trial records from 1307 onward survive in various regional languages and dialects, depending on where a given interrogation took place. From the Latin used in formal papal correspondence down to the various regional French dialects, and even some Occitan, the distinct language of southern France, used in recording local testimony from Templars questioned in that region. For modern historians and translators working with these documents, this linguistic diversity adds a genuine layer of complexity to any attempt at definitive interpretation. since subtle shades of meaning in a coerced confession recorded in regional Occitan dialect by a local scribe with his own particular habits of transcription can be lost or altered when that same testimony gets summarized or referenced in later Latin church documents intended for wider circulation. This is one of the quieter, more technical reasons why historians continue producing new scholarship on the Templars even centuries after the basic outline of their story became well established, since careful linguistic and archival work continues to refine and occasionally revise our understanding of exactly what specific individuals said, and in exactly what words during these pivotal interrogations. The order that never officially ended, there's one more thread worth following before we close this long evening together, because it complicates the tidy narrative of complete dissolution in an interesting way. While the medieval Knights Templar as recognized by the papacy ceased to exist after 1312, various groups over the following centuries have claimed some form of continuity or spiritual descent from the original order, ranging from the Portuguese Order of Christ, which we discussed earlier as a genuine institutional continuation, preserving much of the original Templar structure and personnel under a new name, to a considerably wider array of later organizations. Particularly from the 18th century onward, that adopted Templar names, titles, and symbolism as part of their own institutional identity, without any credible documented organizational continuity back to the actual medieval order. Modern chivalric and fraternal organizations bearing Templar names exist today in various countries, generally operating as charitable, historical, or social fraternal societies, rather than making serious historical claims of unbroken institutional descent from the medieval order, though the popular imagination sometimes conflates these modern organizations with the actual medieval Templars in ways that historians find genuinely frustrating to untangle in public discussion. It's worth being clear that no credible historical evidence supports any secret continuous survival of the actual medieval Templar organizational structure from 1312 to the present day, however appealing that narrative might be for fiction or for organizations seeking to claim a more dramatic and ancient pedigree than their actual documented founding dates support. The genuine legacy of the Templars, rather than existing in any secret, unbroken institutional chain, lives on instead in the more diffuse ways history actually tends to persist. In the surviving architecture of places like the Temple Church in London and the Convent of Christ in Tamar, in the documentary record preserved across scattered European archives, in the ongoing scholarly work of historians continuing to refine our understanding of exactly what happened and why, and in the enduring popular fascination that has made this particular medieval institution one of the most continuously discussed and reimagined subjects in the entire span of European history, 700 years after the last genuine Templar took his final breath. The animals who served too before we close. It's worth giving a moment's attention to the animals who made the entire Templar enterprise possible, since no history of a medieval military order is really complete without acknowledging just how thoroughly its existence depended on horses, and to a lesser extent on other working animals whose contributions rarely receive individual notice in the historical record. A Templar knight's warhorse, sometimes called a destrier, represented a substantial financial investment in its own right, bred and trained specifically for the demands of mounted combat, capable of carrying an armored rider while remaining controllable amid the chaos and noise of battle, a temperament that required careful, patient training over years rather than something any horse possessed naturally from birth. Beyond the warhorse itself, a properly equipped knight typically required additional mounts, a more modest riding horse for ordinary travel that spared the valuable destrier unnecessary wear, and pack animals to carry equipment, supplies, and the various necessities of campaign life. The order's rule includes surprisingly detailed provisions about horse care, specifying how animals should be fed, how injuries should be treated, and establishing clear consequences for brothers who mistreated or neglected the animals under their care, reflecting a practical recognition that the order's entire military capability rested quite literally on the health and availability of enough well-trained horses, a resource that could not simply be replaced quickly or cheaply when lost. Camels, too, appear in the logistical history of the Crusader states, better suited than horses to certain desert transport tasks, and increasingly employed by Crusader forces who learned, over decades of experience in the region, to adapt at least some elements of their logistics to methods already well established among their Muslim neighbors, who had centuries of accumulated experience moving supplies efficiently across the harsh terrain of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. This willingness to adopt locally proven methods, even from cultural and religious rivals, offers one more small example of the practical, adaptive intelligence that helped the Templars and other Crusader institutions survive as long as they did in a genuinely difficult and unfamiliar environment. Far from the more temperate landscapes most of their members had originally grown up in Europe. It's easy to forget, amid all the discussion of kings, popes, and grand strategic movements, that the actual physical experience of Templar military life depended enormously on these animals, their health, their training, their endurance, and that a knight's fate in any given battle rested substantially on the condition of the horse beneath him, an animal that had its own experience of fear, exhaustion, and physical suffering throughout this long conflict. Even if no medieval chronicler thought to record that experience directly, perhaps it's a fitting note to end on before we return to our final human image, that even the most sweeping historical dramas ultimately depend on countless smaller, quieter contributions, human and animal alike, that rarely receive their own chapter in the history books, but without which none of the larger, more famous story could ever have unfolded exactly the way it did. The market day that kept going one last quiet scene before we close, because it's worth remembering that even amid the enormous historical drama of arrests, trials, and executions, ordinary economic life across Europe largely continued on its usual rhythm, largely indifferent to the fate of any single institution, however wealthy or powerful. Picture a market day in a small French town in November of 1307, just weeks after the initial wave of Templar arrests, the town square filled with the same familiar sounds and smells that would have characterized any ordinary market day for generations, livestock calling out, merchants announcing their wares, the particular mixed smell of fresh bread, unwashed wool, and animal manure that characterized nearly every medieval market regardless of season or circumstance. Word of the Templar arrests would certainly have reached this town by now, carried by travelers and merchants passing through, and it would have been a topic of genuine conversation and speculation among the gathered crowd, some expressing shock, others perhaps satisfaction if they had personal grievances against local Templar landlords or creditors. Still others simply curious about what such dramatic events in distant Paris might eventually mean for their own more immediate local concerns. But the actual business of the market day, buying grain, selling cloth, negotiating the price of a cart of firewood, would have continued regardless, because ordinary people, whatever their opinions about distant political and religious controversies, still needed to eat, still needed to clothe themselves, still needed to conduct the countless small daily transactions that kept medieval life functioning. This coexistence of dramatic historical upheaval alongside the persistent, almost stubborn continuity of ordinary daily life is worth holding on to as we bring this long evening to its close. The Templars' downfall genuinely mattered, reshaping the financial and religious landscape of medieval Europe in ways historians still study carefully today. But it unfolded within a much larger world of ordinary people continuing to live their ordinary lives, largely unaffected in their daily rhythms by the grand political dramas playing out among kings and popes. Perhaps this, too, is part of what makes history worth sitting with slowly, the way we've tried to do together tonight, not just the dramatic peaks that dominate the history books, but the quiet, persistent continuity of ordinary human life running underneath them, largely unrecorded, but no less real for the silence surrounding it. What the rule didn't mention we've drawn heavily throughout this evening on the Order's formal rule, and it's worth pausing, near the very end, on what that document deliberately left unsaid, because the gaps in a historical source can sometimes be as revealing as what it actually records. The rule tells us a great deal about behavior, ritual, and discipline, but it says almost nothing about the emotional or spiritual interior life of the men who lived under it, offering no window into how an individual brother actually felt about his vows on a difficult day, whether he ever doubted his calling, whether he missed a family he had left behind, or whether the discipline that structured every hour of his day ever felt to him personally like a genuine comfort rather than a burden. This silence isn't unusual for medieval institutional documents, which were written to regulate behavior rather than to record inner experience. But it does mean that historians reconstructing Templar daily life are always working, to some degree, from the outside in, inferring emotional and psychological reality from behavioral rules rather than from direct testimony about how those rules actually felt to live under. Occasionally, a stray detail in trial testimony or a surviving personal letter offers a small crack of more direct insight, a brother describing homesickness, or doubt, or simple exhaustion. But these moments are rare, scattered, and often filtered through the coercive circumstances of the 1307 interrogations, rather than offered freely during the Order's more ordinary, functioning centuries. This is worth acknowledging honestly as we close this long evening together, because it would be dishonest to suggest we have fully recovered the inner emotional world of the medieval Templars simply by carefully studying their rule, their financial records, and their architecture. We have recovered a great deal about what they did, how they organized themselves, and how their institution rose and fell across two remarkable centuries. What we have recovered far less completely is how any single one of them actually felt, in the quiet, private moments between the formal structure of prayer and duty, about the life they had chosen, or in many cases had been guided toward by family expectation, and about the extraordinary, occasionally terrifying, historical current their small individual lives had become swept up within. That gap between what we can document and what we can never fully know is not a failure of this evening's storytelling. It's simply the honest shape of history itself, and perhaps sitting comfortably with that uncertainty, rather than papering over it with false confidence, is the most respectful way we can close out this long, quiet walk through the rise and fall of the Knights Templar. The morning we started with "Let's return before we close" to that tired man warming his hands beside a brazier, the one we met at the very beginning of tonight's story, keeping horses fed at a small commandery in the French countryside on an ordinary morning that would turn out to be anything but ordinary. We never learn his name. He is one of thousands of men whose individual lives disappeared into the broader current of this history, remembered, if at all, only as a number in a chronicler's estimate of how many Templars were arrested across France in October of 1307. It's worth sitting with that anonymity for a moment, because it's easy, telling a story this large, to focus entirely on kings and grand masters and popes, the handful of names that survive clearly enough in the historical record to build a narrative around. But the overwhelming majority of people touched by this story, the sergeants tending sheep in Yorkshire, the clerks recording rents in Aragon, the young knight who never made it home from Hattin, the elderly brother living out his final years quietly after the order's dissolution, absolved and forgotten, left behind no memoir, no portrait, no name that echoes down to us clearly. They lived through an extraordinary 2 centuries of history, built something that briefly reshaped how medieval Europe moved money and protected pilgrims, and then watched, or simply experienced without fully understanding, its sudden and complete unmaking. Perhaps that's the quietest, truest lesson this story offers, more than any curse or hidden treasure ever could. Great institutions, no matter how wealthy or seemingly permanent, exist inside the same fragile, uncertain human world as everyone within them, and their endings, when they come, rarely arrive with the drama that later storytelling tends to impose upon them. They arrive, more often, on an ordinary morning with a knock at the door, felt most immediately not by kings or popes, but by an anonymous man warming his hands over a small fire, uncertain, in that particular moment, of almost everything except the cold. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over a place once its purpose has been taken from it, and it's worth imagining, one last time, what that stillness might have felt like at a small Templar preceptory somewhere in the French countryside in the months following the order's final dissolution in 1312. The chapel bells that had once marked the 8 canonical hours of every single day, for decades, perhaps for a century or more at some of the older houses, would have gone silent or been repurposed to serve whatever new institution eventually took over the property. The stable that had once housed the order's horses, tended with the careful, detailed attention the rule required, would have passed into other hands, its animals redistributed, sold, or simply absorbed into someone else's household. The refectory where brothers had once eaten in near silence, while a reader recited scripture aloud, would have fallen quiet in an entirely different way, no longer a place of communal discipline, but simply an empty room waiting for whatever came next. We began this evening with a nameless man warming his hands over a brazier, uncertain, and afraid on an ordinary morning that would turn out to mark the beginning of the end for everything he had built his life around. It feels right to imagine him once more now, not at that first terrible moment of arrest, but perhaps years later, if he survived at all, an old man by then, living out whatever remained of his life in whatever quiet corner of Europe, accepted him after the order that had once given his existence its entire shape and purpose had ceased, officially and permanently, to exist. Did he think back often to those early morning bells, to the particular smell of his preceptory's stable, to the faces of brothers he had shared decades of meals and prayers with, most of them now scattered, imprisoned, or dead? We can't know. But it feels certain that he did think of it, in whatever way an old man in the early 14th century processed the sudden and complete unmaking of the only adult life he had ever known. This is, in the end, what history actually consists of, far more often than the dramatic battles and papal decrees that tend to organize our textbooks and documentaries. It consists of exactly this kind of quiet, largely unrecorded human experience, repeated countless times across countless lives, each one carrying its own particular weight of memory, loss, and adjustment that no chronicle ever thought important enough to preserve in detail. The Knights Templar rose from 9 impoverished knights sharing a single horse to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in medieval Christendom, spanning a continent, reshaping how money moved across borders, fighting and dying across 2 centuries of crusading warfare, and then vanishing almost entirely within the span of a single decade. Brought down not by any external enemy on any battlefield, but by the calculated ambition of one king who needed money more than he needed to preserve an institution that had, by then, largely outlived the singular purpose it was originally founded to serve. And yet something of them remains, scattered across the physical and documentary landscape of modern Europe and the Middle East, in round churches built to echo a tomb in Jerusalem, in worn stone effigies of knights lying flat on cold chapel floors, in fragile parchment charters recording a widow's small donation of vineyard land 700 years ago. In the underground vaults beneath a contested holy site where 9 tired men once stabled their few shared horses and had no idea what their small, struggling idea would eventually become. History rarely offers clean, satisfying endings, and the Templars' story certainly doesn't, full as it is of unresolved questions, contested interpretations, and genuine uncertainty that honest historians continue wrestling with even now. But perhaps that unresolved quality is itself part of what makes this story worth returning to again and again across the centuries. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it reminds us, gently and repeatedly, how much of the past survives only in fragments, how much depends on chance documents surviving in forgotten archives, and how many ordinary human lives, like the nameless man we began with tonight, quietly carried the full weight of extraordinary historical events without ever once appearing by name in the story history eventually chose to tell about them. Thank you for spending this evening with that story, and with all the smaller stories tucked inside it. If you found something in this history that surprised you, or made you see something a little differently than before, that's exactly what these long evenings are for. Rest well tonight, wherever you're listening from, and I'll see you again soon for another quiet walk through the past.